Hey everybody, welcome back to A Flair for the Curious. I'm Anthony J. Swindell, and on today's episode of the podcast, you'll hear John Freese and I discuss an academic article he recently published titled The Dependent Origination of Whiteness. The article explores racial formation and, through the Buddhist lens of causality, how the identification with whiteness is perpetuated. In the paper, connections to clinical trauma therapy are included to ground the discussion in a secular, empirical, and trauma-informed context. You're invited to read the paper, and links are in the notes to this show, but if all that sounds too heady, I think we do a great job of taking these serious topics of social justice, race relations, and mental health and psychology, and we have a fun, upbeat, and enjoyably informative conversation about them that's easy to follow along, and I think it's digestible. The discussion we have is meaningful, and a lot of great points and topics are brought up that are relevant during these trying times of social inequity and racial hostility. I'm really glad to be able to share this with all of you. John Freese is the co-host, along with Nick Meinhardt, of the Down With the Dharma podcast. And although Nick won't be joining us today, this episode is going to be released on both Down With the Dharma and here on A Flair for the Curious. I encourage you to check out Down With the Dharma podcast, which aims to bring the teachings of Dharma down to earth and make them applicable to our everyday lives. I've certainly enjoyed listening along, so I definitely recommend you go have a listen yourself. John, or Professor Freese, as I call him on campus, teaches several courses at University of the West in Rosemead, California, including contemplative practice, Buddhist social ethics, service learning, and religion. I also took an independent study class with him on Eastern philosophy that was really helpful for me to make sense of so many overlapping ideas and traditions that I had encountered, as John draws on many years of practice, travel, and study. For instance, in addition to practicing in South India in the tradition of Ramana Maharshi, John trained as a Buddhist monk for 12 years, including 6 with Thich Nhat Hanh. He is also currently a lay member of Thich Nhat Hanh's Order of Interbeing. John also holds a Master's of Divinity in Buddhist chaplaincy from the University of the West and is currently working on his PhD at Claremont School of Theology, where his research and clinical training are focused on developing a Buddhist model of pastoral care and counseling. John has taught Buddhism and meditation in prisons in the past, is a co-founder of the Engaged Buddhist Alliance that continues those efforts today, and he currently works with formerly incarcerated people who are getting back to civilian life. I want to bring up a few points before we begin, a correction, an addition, and a comment, really. Firstly, a correction. John had noted that at one point in our discussion he mentions the Black Panthers, but he was actually referring to the Muslim Brotherhood. The addition is that we wanted to add to the Buddhist Peace Fellowship that we had mentioned, and include and give a shout out to other engaged Buddhists and engaged Buddhist groups, like Lama Rod, who was recently interviewed on the Down With the Dharma podcast, Angel Kyoto Williams, Anne Glegg, and the East Bay Meditation Center, to name a few. If you're interested in getting involved or learning more, there are definitely some great examples out there of how to practice Dharma while engaging with some of these difficult issues. Links to some of the names mentioned, as well as the Dependent Origination of Whiteness journal article and the Down With the Dharma podcast, are in the show notes to this episode, so please do go check those out. Before we jump in, I invite you to please subscribe, rate, review, and share this podcast. Your support goes a long way, and I'd like to thank everyone who has been listening and contributing so far. It's been really awesome and rewarding for me personally to hear how people have been finding so much value in the discussions that we're having. If you haven't already, I encourage you to go check out some of our past episodes, catch up, and get on board. Go to aflairforthecurious.com or explore more episodes wherever you listen. And if you'd like to follow along on social media, I'm on Facebook at facebook.com/aflairforthecurious, on Instagram at Anthony J. Swindell, on Twitter at Tony J. Swindell, and as always, you're invited to email me directly at aflairforthecurious@gmail.com. All right, my friends, the time has come. Let's take a conscious breath together before we get started. So exhale completely and go ahead and inhale slowly and deeply. Hold it for a second and gently release. I hope you all dig this conversation I had with John Freese.
Then the shuttle has cleared the tower.
Hi, my name is Anthony Swindell, and I'm host of A Flair for the Curious.
And I'm John Freese. I'm one of the co-hosts of Down With the Dharma podcast.
And we've got a special episode for you today. We're doing a little bit of cross-pollination. We're going to be publishing this podcast on both podcasts. So we'll be chit-chatting today about John's recently published paper, The Dependent Origination of Whiteness.
So yeah, that's a paper that got published in December in this ethnic studies journal called Kalfu that's edited by George Lipschitz, who's one of the main forerunners of critical race theory. And so basically I'm analyzing white supremacy from a Buddhist perspective. And yeah, as the people from my podcast know, what we're interested in with Down With the Dharma is engaged Buddhism, social justice, the crossover between contemplative practice and awareness that comes from that, and social justice issues, collective issues as well.
Yeah, so I really enjoyed the first couple episodes of your podcast, Down With the Dharma. So you did an episode 0 where you introduced yourself and your co-host, and I thought it was a wonderful way to get into your background. I know I've asked a lot of the questions that you answered in our personal time together about your background as time as a Buddhist monk in Thich Nhat Hanh's order, as well as your time in India. I like that you guys talked about Ram Dass. So yeah, for anybody who's listening, to get more of a background on you, John, I would definitely recommend checking out your episode 0. And I feel like for people who listen to my podcast, it's also thoroughly informative for some of the things I'm interested in. You guys really addressed a lot of Buddhist topics, spiritual progression, how you guys came into it, and like I said, you talked about Ram Dass a lot, which is dear to my heart and possibly a big part of why I have this podcast. Some of my favorite podcasters who are comedians or just personalities, kind of seemingly down-to-earth guys, like I eventually came to find out that they were all part of Neem Karoli Baba Satsang and Ram Dass Satsang, and they all hang out in Hawaii for the retreats and stuff. And I was like, oh man, like, yeah, so podcasts have really given me a sense of community when I didn't have a sangha and like-minded people to hang out with. I was able to find that community through podcasts, and so this common thread of Ram Dass seems to weave its way through a variety of traditions.
Yeah, and I don't know if I mentioned in episode 0, but I met him in Boulder, like in the early 90s. And I mean, reading his book, Be Here Now, had a big influence on me when I was in college. And then when I actually met him, it was like a powerful experience. So I haven't interacted with him recently. My co-host Nick is the one who's now he's spent time with him in Hawaii, and
cool.
But yeah, you can't get away from him.
Yeah. Yeah, and then they just finished the mandir in Taos, the Hanuman mandir. So he actually left the island to check it out. I know he's just been staying there, but
oh wow, okay, yeah, I've been spending a lot of time in New Mexico since I was a kid.
Oh wow,
but I only went to the Hanuman temple for the first time like a couple of years ago. Yeah, and nice. There's one of our fellow students at U West, Brock. I forget his last name, but he's gone and done a retreat there as well. Yeah,
nice.
Yeah.
So we know each other through U.S. So I'm just going to read your bio real quick. You didn't really talk about it exactly what you're doing right now.
Yeah.
You gave more of your background on your previous
Sure.
podcast, so maybe it'll be interesting for your listeners too. But on your paper, you list that you're a doctoral student at the Claremont School of Theology, where your research and clinical training are focused on developing a Buddhist model of pastoral care and counseling. And you are an adjunct professor at University of the West, which is where I know you from, where you teach classes on contemplative practice, Buddhist social ethics, service learning, and religion. So I didn't take your religion course, but I've taken all of your other courses, and your service learning was really cool. You're helping students to do community service and teaching about the divine abodes of Buddhism. And we learned a lot about incarcerated peoples. That was an option for people to go. So I really enjoyed that class. I also took your meditation class, and then we did a little bit of independent study on Eastern philosophy afterwards, which was really helpful for me to understand the overlap of a lot of Buddhist and Hindu terminology and concepts and practice. So I definitely really enjoyed that. But possibly most applicable to the conversation we're going to be having today is the Buddhist social ethics class, where we tackled a variety of social justice topics and then looked at them through the lens of dependent origination, which is what we're going to get into today.
Yeah.
That was a really cool class. It really turned me on to like the authors that we covered in there, like Naomi Campbell and
Naomi Klein.
Naomi Klein, sorry.
Yeah.
Naomi
Sure.
Klein, Michelle Alexander, which her work is really relevant to today, what your paper's about, and the continuation of racism today through prison industrial complex and institutionalized racism that is an extension of slavery. So I really appreciated having that progressive outlook brought into the classroom. I think that school is a wonderful place for people to get turned on to those kind of ideas, and I would definitely like to see more of that in the class. Yeah. So, your podcast, Down with the Dharma. Before we jump into your paper, I just kind of want to talk about that a little bit.
Sure.
Like, so you said in your episode 0, talking about it, the idea of being down is the koan for the show.
Right.
And so, like a koan is, I guess, kind of like a riddle that is not meant to be answered. That's kind of makes you think and makes you kind of sit with the paradox more than anything.
Yeah.
And so, what does it mean to be down? And you had mentioned Thich Nhat Hanh said we have to get down to the practice. But you're also concerned with bringing the practice down to earth and down from the upper echelons of society where only people who can afford expensive retreats are able to practice.
Yeah.
So I got what you meant conceptually, but then when you launched your first episode, I got it in a much more concrete way.
Yeah.
Because dick control,
Yeah.
you're getting right down to the nitty gritty. You're not, you're taking it out of the temple, out of the monastery,
Right.
talking about real issues that we all need to deal with, using the hilarious Eddie Murphy as the jumping off point, and using his skit about dick control.
Yeah.
I don't know, you want to talk a little bit about bringing the practice down to earth.
So I started meditating when I was in college, Vassar College in Poughkeepsie, New York, and then at the same time I was doing body-centered trauma therapy. I was working with a therapist in Boulder because my brother was in Boulder, and then I was also learning how to play West African drums, and so I learned how to do meditation at Zen Mountain Monastery, and the practice there is that you count the breath while you focus on the hara, and the hara is a point like a couple inches below the belly button, a couple inches inside. And the idea is like the breath is a rhythm, and you're feeling the beat of the rhythm there in the belly, and then you're counting the breath in time with that beat.
Yeah.
And then my drum teacher, when he was teaching me to play West African drums, he was like, focus in your belly, feel the rhythm in your belly.
Yeah.
And so it's like, where do you feel the downbeat? Where do you feel the one? It's like you feel it down in the belly, right?
Yeah.
And so my experience then of meditation and drumming overlapped with each other. So I had the feeling when I was meditating that I was playing drums, or when I was playing drums, I had the feeling I was meditating. And so there was this feeling of getting down into my belly, being able to step back from the conceptual mind and identifying with thought pattern and conceptual mind, and dropping into a more intuitive, like embodied awareness. So that was like, when you think of music and people say get down, it's like that means like you have to feel the beat, you have to feel the rhythm, you have to be in the groove, right?
Yeah.
So that feeling is the same for me, like in terms of meditation. You have to get down to be really present and meditating. And so then of course there's a whole other level of connotation around African American wisdom about, is somebody down or not? Meaning, are you part of the problem, like part of the settler colonialism, extractivism, racism, white supremacy? Are you, like, to use a reggae term, are you like the down presser, meaning pushing people down? Or are you down, meaning are you down with the common person, the average person? Are you aware of the suffering that's going on, like, for people that are not in a place of privilege, if you're like one of the target groups?
Yeah.
So then that, to me, is another meaning of what does it mean to be down. So for me, like, I'm coming from like a hell of a lot of privilege. Like, I'm like white, straight, male, affluent, in Texas Republican deal. So, like I've been on this like path of trying to decondition myself from all of that and to get down, and that's a whole process that I'm still working on.
Yeah, I like that you talked about you were a nice white liberal, and through a partner you had, you learned to be an embodied anti-racist.
Yeah, I learned to tell the difference. Like when I went to Vassar, I would say that's when I became white liberal, right? Like in my mind, conceptually, I was anti-racist. I was for equality of all kinds,
Yeah.
But that's different from having an embodied experience of what the suffering is for people of color, and like, is your behavior really supporting liberation of people of color and other target groups, or is your behavior still part of the structural system that's causing the oppression?
Yeah.
And so for me, that's also then where this whole notion of trauma comes in, because I think, these two psychotherapists from Pacifica College, which is in Santa Barbara, so Helene Schulman and I want to say Marie Watkins, something Watkins. So they wrote a book called Towards Liberation Psychologies, and they talked about different kinds of historical trauma. Like you can have the victim trauma, you can have bystander trauma, and you can have perpetrator trauma.
Yeah.
Meaning you're involved in some experience of violence or exploitation, and as a result you're traumatized from that.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me then one of the big processes of getting down means getting in touch with historical trauma. And because the way I understand trauma is coming from this body-centered somatic approach, which overlaps a big amount with my Buddhist practice.
Yeah. You talk about that a bit in your paper too. I really like to see those concrete overlaps.
That getting down means getting in touch with your body and what the memory your body is holding, right? And so that's individual and collective. So I feel like to go from white liberal to embodied anti-racist means you have to get in touch with your body as an individual, but also your body as part of a collective system.
Yeah.
And that's not easy to do. Yeah, it's intense stuff comes up that you have to deal with. So when Thich Nhat Hanh, he was giving a Dharma talk, and he was saying, you have to get down to the practice. And so he wasn't consciously making the association with the African-American term, what it means to get down.
Yeah.
But what he did mean was you have to not just think about it or read about it or conceptualize about it. You actually have to.
Yeah, so that's something else that you mentioned in your introductory episode. So the tail end of your bio is that you trained as a Buddhist monk for 12 years, including 6 with Thich Nhat Hanh, and that you're currently a lay member of the Order of Interbeing. So you talked about your background and how you got into spirituality, and you had met some saints, and you saw there was something really to it, and you thought that there was an actual path for this becoming a career through Thich Nhat Hanh's order. But that he's not just into the meditating. He's socially engaged. He's quite the activist. He did a lot of work with Martin Luther King, and he was active against the war in Vietnam, and again in the 90s and 2000s. So you kind of were brought back into the social engagement. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So he's considered one of the main 4. I don't know. There's a whole history of engaged Buddhism, but I guess you could just say he's one of the main voices of engaged Buddhism.
Mm-hmm.
And so, coming from his experience of the war in Vietnam, where he was speaking out against the war, he was meeting with Martin Luther King in Chicago in the 60s.
Yeah.
So they were both putting their bodies on the line to call out against I mean, it's his take on it isn't. I mean, he was calling out against the war, which has within it an implicit critique of colonialism, but in a way he kind of doesn't address it head on in the same way that, like, say, Martin Luther King addressed it.
Okay.
And I think that's a very interesting nuance, right, in and of itself. So recognizing social injustice and doing something about it as a Buddhist, but then there's this fine line of, like, how political do you get? It's like that's one thing I'm interested in is, like, you think of, like, Martin Luther King as coming from the black church, or you think of, like, is it Anthony Barber? Who's the guy that does the Moral Mondays in North Carolina? He's this African-American minister. And so they're openly political, talking about who you should vote for, who you shouldn't vote for, things like that. Whereas Thich Nhat Hanh that tradition will hold back from that.
Okay. Interesting.
So there's an interesting tension there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm kind of wanting to push that further, right? Like what would Buddhist socialism look like, you know, or if Buddhists were openly for the Green New Deal, for Bernie Sanders, for Social Democrats of America.
Some of whom are.
Yeah. Yeah, how does that relate to Buddhism and Buddhist practice? Yeah.
Buddhism is so tricky, though, because it's interpreted so variously.
Yeah.
And I think some people are trying to not cause suffering on any level.
Right.
Whereas, you know, it's also, I think, about skillful means. Which, well, you know, you're going to save some, but you have to cause harm to others. And it just seems to be interpreted so differently. It seems hard to get everybody on the same page.
Yeah, and I think you could make the case that in a lot of ways Buddhism's been on the bench as far as social justice for its overall history, because it's more about this practice of seclusion and attaining nirvana and leaving the world behind, in a sense. I mean, there is the bodhisattva ideal where you want to embrace everyone's suffering and help them reach nirvana, but that's not the same as talking about who should be king or not king and that kind of thing.
Historically, I guess it was a rejection of that whole system, so it makes sense that it's a little touchy to re-engage with it.
Right, so we're kind of, I mean, of course there's examples like the Sarvodaya movement in Sri Lanka or Sulak Shiva Raksha in Thailand, or, I mean, there's a full engaged Buddhism movement that did come about in the 20th century as a response to colonialism. But I feel like there's still layers of that can be unpacked, or there's thresholds still that can be crossed over that hasn't been done yet. Or it's just beginning. Yeah.
Do you? It looks like it's definitely kindling and getting bigger. Like whether it's the Zen peacemakers or like we talked a lot about David Loy and environmentalism.
Yeah.
So it seems like there is a contingency
or
of
Buddhist Peace Fellowship. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think it's picking up pace? Especially with the whole climate coming to a issue coming to a head.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. I think one is more people of color are getting into Buddhism. More people who are not part of the upper middle. Like some people refer to Buddha like the upper middle way. Like it's for rich white people that have time to meditate. So I think it's getting younger. It's getting more diverse. It's getting more diverse in terms of class, race, gender, things like that. And we are now reaching this collective crisis where everybody has to get involved. You can't not get involved. And at least in the area I'm interested in working at, the crossover between trauma therapy and Buddhism is so substantial that for me, like, the way of understanding what's going on in terms of in terms of the crisis we're in, or in terms of what are the mechanics of white supremacy, that this coming together of Buddhism and trauma therapy, I think, is a big way to understand what's happening and possibly make a difference.
Yeah. What is your doctoral studies focusing on? Do you have your dissertation lined up?
Yes, I'm just now entering the writing phase of it. So I interviewed 6 psychotherapists who are in the Thich Nhat Hanh tradition.
Oh, wow.
And I asked them how did they integrate Buddhism and trauma therapy together.
Nice.
And so the idea is trauma therapy and Buddhism both have theories and practices on how to deal with suffering or trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, there's a lot of overlap in both of them. And so, yeah, how could Buddhism be used more directly to heal trauma? And then how could trauma therapy benefit from Buddhism? Because if you think of Buddhist practice done as a community, done on large scale, like with retreats, because trauma therapy, usually you think it's like one-on-one therapy, a therapist and a client,
Mm-hmm.
or maybe a small group, right? Whereas Buddhism, you can scale it up to large groups.
Oh, that makes so much sense, because then you can you can heal our communities in a different way.
Right.
It gives us opportunity for individual and communal healing and growth.
Right.
Wow.
Right.
Yeah. That's wonderful. That's powerful. Yeah.
Which is a lot of what Thich Nhat Hanh has been doing.
Mm.
And so I think bringing in the specifics of somatic trauma therapy into how Thich Nhat Hanh's teaching and how other teachers are teaching, I think can help clarify intense levels of suffering and provide ways of dealing with it that hasn't been done before.
Yeah. How did your time as a monastic with Thich Nhat Hanh inform the work that you're doing now?
Yeah. So when I was in college, I was working with a therapist named Stephanie Mines, who she trained under Peter Levine, who does somatic experiencing. So that was a big chunk of the therapy we were doing was somatic experiencing. And then when I became a monk with Thich Nhat Hanh, he was teaching the 4 foundations of mindfulness, which for me felt a lot of what somatic experiencing felt like very similar in terms of what your actual experience is. And so right at the beginning, it felt like, this is the same fundamental process, like healing from trauma and engaging in meditation to heal from suffering. It's the same essential process.
Yeah, bringing it down into the body.
Right.
I like this running theme.
So then I think one of the big influences from Thich Nhat Hanh is, making meditation become a way of life. And then this idea then also of getting in touch with your experience directly, your experience of your body and your emotions and your mind. And there's a big part of it is dealing with whatever suffering you have coming up and and embracing that and transforming that. But if you keep working that process further and further, it's like by getting in touch with your body, you go deeper than your body to this experience of interbeing, which is beyond your individual body. So it opens up into an experience of transcending your individual body, but not like a dissociated transcendence.
Mm-hmm.
It's like you're getting more in touch with your body, which is opening you up more to this transpersonal experience of reality.
Yeah.
And so he is someone who, he doesn't say what level of awakening he's reached, but when you're in his presence, you feel this guy's got something going on.
Even through like a TV screen or a book, I get that sensation. So I haven't had the fortunate experience of being in his physical presence, but I get that vibe even from engaging with his texts.
Right. So this whole awakening a realized master, however way we want to define what realization is, like being around someone who has reached a deep level of awakening, it's like, like it makes you relate to reality in a completely different way. It's like, there's this whole deeper level that it's possible to get in touch with, and that deeper level reveals like a deeper, more subtle level of suffering within you that you didn't even know you had. Or maybe you like, for me, I had this like existential angst, like fear of annihilation, fear of death, crisis. And then when you're around somebody like him, it's like this feeling of, there's like a practice and a way where this can get resolved. Like that deep crisis can be fully transformed. So just being around that, and it's like obviously I'm not fully awakened, so I can't say from direct experience, but it's like there's an intuitive feeling that this is possible. Like,
and surely you've had tremendous benefits from it. You've told me about left and
right.
Yeah,
that just being around somebody like that, that it propels your practice in a much deeper way. And I mean, it's a double-edged sword. It also brings stuff up more at the same time, so it's kind of like,
I mean, you're putting yourself through some pretty extremes, and I mean, you talked about it at length on your other podcasts about you know, celibacy as a part of it, and you're giving up your possessions, and I think you and I have talked about like you're not in seclusion, you're in a community of other monks, and you're still dealing with all the same interpersonal problems that come up in living in communities, and and that's gotta bring up all of that deep internal stuff. Anytime I've lived in a community, it's brought up a lot of issues that I thought were resolved to work on.
So he would make the community be a way of getting your buttons pushed, and then now you have to practice.
What was that thing you told me about resolution? You said like about every week you guys would have some kind of a group activity where you would work on talking about some of the issues that were coming up?
Yeah, it's called Beginning Anew. And so it was basically like, you could think of it as like, it's almost like a restorative justice practice, like to be done within a community. So, we would meet together once a week, the monastic community, and in this case usually it was just the monks meeting with themselves, and then the nuns usually lived in another location. They would meet in their own location. And so it had 4 parts. So it was watering flowers, which means like expressing gratitude or so you're sitting in a circle as a group, and then if you want to speak, you start speaking, and then you're talking about another person in the group. And so then you start out with what are positive things about that person that you like,
that's the general process for giving criticism.
So
start with a compliment.
It breaks you out of the all or nothing, they're 100% evil, they're the devil kind of thing. It's like,
it's not just for them receiving; it's also for you putting it out there. That makes sense.
It's making you break out of this dualistic, polarizing way of relating. So first, it's expressing positive things that the person has done, either for you in particular, or just positive qualities that they have that you admire. And then the second one is you express regret, like something you've done where you feel like you've caused them suffering. And so you're expressing regret, and depending on the situation, that might be all that you're doing is you fucked up and you want to apologize. And so this is a space to do that, right? Or it may only even be the first step, like somebody did something that was really cool and you didn't get a chance to point it out until now. So now's your chance to like say, that was awesome. Like,
best case scenario.
Right? Yeah. So first is like, wow, that was awesome. Second, I fucked up and I'm sorry. This is what I did. Okay. And then the third is, you did something that made me suffer. And this is like one of the key things is that you're expressing it from a place of vulnerability. It's not from a place of judgment or attack or hatred. It's you're coming from an open heart. But I mean, you're also not coming at it from putting yourself down either, but it's like you're coming from a place of vulnerability, saying, when you did this, it caused me to suffer. So it's a practice of being in touch with your own suffering and being able to express that suffering in a pure way. And then that's an art, I think, to learn how to do that.
Yeah, that's really important.
Yeah. And then the fourth stage would be, and Thich Nhat Hanh, he kind of would change, he would tweak it over time. So the fourth step, it depends on which time period you're looking at when he's teaching what that fourth step is. But the way I first learned it and the way I still like to do it, the fourth step is, what are the underlying conditions that have an influence on this suffering, right?
Okay.
So say somebody did something to me, they said something mean to me and it caused me to suffer, and then maybe that resembled some experience I had in my childhood where, like, the way my parent abused me or something. And so then that deeper level is allowed to be recognized and brought into the space.
Interesting. Is somebody mediating this while all this is going on?
You have someone that sits at the bell. So this is kind of one of the genius of Thich Nhat Hanh, is he's taking traditional meditation practice and forms and then turning them into interpersonal communal practices.
Interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
So when a normal session of meditation, someone's sitting at the bell and they ring it, that's the beginning. You sit for 30 minutes, they ring it again. Mm-hmm. Okay, when you're doing group practice that involves talking to each other, you start the session by ringing the bell and following your breathing, just getting grounded. And then throughout the session, there may be moments where the person who's sitting at the bell feels like, oh, the energy's getting too intense, or it's starting to escalate in a way that's beyond what's metabolizing. So we all need to take a chill and, like, hit the bell. So that person will hit the bell to chill everything out again. Yeah.
Wow.
And for the most part, that's the only level of intervention that's going on. I can't remember a specific instance where someone else would have to step in to stop something from going on beyond just the bell getting rung.
Well, at this point, everybody's a monastic. You've already done some level of training.
Yeah.
I imagine you all have some level of self-control. It should be a responsible,
in theory,
level of conversation. I would. Think.
There were times where it got a little messy and shit would spill over, but for the most part, people would respect the form, and then but so there's somebody there to ring the bell if the experience feels like it's getting to where it's going from a contained experience where you're expressing suffering or you're expressing regret to it escalating into judgment or hatred or where someone feels like they're really getting pushed down upon or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, it seems like that could be a really useful technique for groups on any level, families.
And that we like
to process. That's like, it seems so powerful.
Every summer we have what's known as like the family retreat at his different monasteries. So it's made for families to come and learn mindfulness practice and be together. And then there is a time for families, if they want to practice beginning anew. And so the monastics will facilitate families doing beginning anew with each other. Yeah.
Nice.
And that is some of the more transformative moments during those retreats.
Wow. Yeah, I wish that I could have had some of that growing up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've listened to some of the Dharma talks from some of those family retreats. I always enjoy when they open up the questions to the children.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because the questions are, out of the mouth of babes, and then his answers are good no matter who he's talking to. And so I loved listening to those when I was really listening to a lot of Dharma talks back in the day.
Yeah. And again, I think that it's one of his strong points, as well as, I mean, he's in the world of Buddhism, Thich Nhat Hanh, and on one level, he's seen as someone who's done this amazing work of translating Buddhism into U.S. culture in a way that is very accessible. And then I would add to that he's taken Buddhist practice and made it something that really does happen in the family. So it's not just about the monk by himself or herself doing meditation in the forest. It is about, like, how do you apply this practice in your daily life, in your family experience?
Very practical.
So it gets into what would normally in our culture be the realm of psychotherapy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so that's one of the big contributions he's made, is how to apply Buddhism in a context that is very interpersonal, and it's dealing with issues around family or community. So I think that is one of his main contributions. And then there's people that have criticized him for watering down the Dharma, or like over focusing on that and then leaving out the whole nirvana thing.
Oh yeah.
Or like, I don't know, like making that less of an important thing, right? Or taking teachings that normally are in this context of like these transpersonal states of consciousness in meditation, and then applying it to like a family situation where someone, like a dad, like lost it with his kid, so
I doubt it's somebody who is fully enlightened doing the criticism, though. So
right.
Wow. Something else that you had said on one of your talks is that you talked about moving from the heart space.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of correlates to bringing it down into your body and embodying it, and the wisdom of the heart. And I was wondering if you could talk about that, maybe in the context of Thich Nhat Hanh's teaching, and how that was brought forth in you while you were studying with him.
Yeah. So the Pali word chitta is translated as heart mind. So there is no word in English that it can translate into as one word. So sometimes it's translated just as mind, and people will confuse that with conceptual mind.
Okay.
But heart mind is the more accurate translation.
Now, this is the Buddhist translation of the word chitta. In Hindu translations, there's a variety of Hindu traditions. Chitta is usually associated with consciousness. Is this a different translation of the word altogether in the Buddhist context?
So then, like, depends on which school of Buddhism. Like, say in Mahayana Buddhism, Yogacara, you get into the 8 consciousnesses, and I think for me the best way to think about it is the difference between the conceptual mind and the intuitive awareness, the experience of intuitive awareness.
Okay.
Or you could say, the experience of the witnessing self or observing self, which is more direct, more immediate, and whereas the conceptual mind is like one step behind. It's like
analyzing the actuality of what's happening.
Right. And so, in meditation practice, it's like you're practicing getting aware of the breathing, and then that helps you make the transition from being caught up in thoughts so the difference between being aware of a thought versus thinking a thought. And so that means you're dropping into this deeper level of awareness that can be aware of a thought as just something that's coming and going in the awareness, as opposed to this identification with thought as me, who I am, or So dropping down into the heart to me means like that you're letting go of identifying with your conceptual mind, and you're dropping down into this deeper experience of just being itself, which is experience. I experience that in the heart region when I'm doing meditation.
Okay.
You can't finally pin it down to a physical location in the heart, but it tends to have a feeling of it's down in the heart.
In the chest area. And I know some interpretations of the hridaya, that's the heart cave, which is to the opposite space of the heart, and just this whole region. And I know we've talked about it variously. Sometimes a person will have an experience and it'll get canonized, and that's where you're supposed to think it goes, but it's more descriptive than prescriptive, and you should really just pay attention to what's arising in you naturally.
Right.
Yeah.
And then also even before I became a monk, I got interested in Taoism and internal alchemy, which talks about sexual energy, breath energy, and then spirit. And then again, that word in Chinese, and I haven't yet fully gotten the pronunciation of this one. I think in Japanese, I think it's Shen, and in Chinese, I think it's Sen. And it's the same word. It's translated as heart mind.
Okay.
And so it's the experience of awareness itself, being itself, and the way you so in this Taoist internal alchemy, they'll talk about sexual breath and spirit, and the idea is you're supposed to conserve the sexual energy. So if you're a monastic on a celibate practice, that means you don't activate the sexual energy.
Yeah.
And then that energy gets stored in your body, and then you do work with the breath energy, which is in Sanskrit is prana, in Chinese it's qi, in Japanese it's ki. So it's connected with the breath, but it's subtle energy.
Yeah.
So for me, that Japanese Zen practice that I do, where I'm counting the breath, focusing on the hara, which is in the belly, that's where qi is getting generated. And so when that qi is getting generated, the qing sublimates into the qi, the qing being the sexual energy. It's not sexual energy like you're not like aroused sexually, but it's that
like a passionate urge kind of.
It's you just feel this substantial solid energy. It's energy that becomes matter, right? Is getting sublimated into qi.
Okay.
So it's this feeling again, like you're down, like you're getting down. It's not hot sexual energy, but it's this experience of very solid and all the way down. You're using your whole being to do this thing.
Nice.
And so then. So the way you lose qi is through intense reactive emotions. So if you have like a big outburst of anger, or you fall into a big panic attack or anxiety or whatever, you're burning up your qi. And so it's through practice of awareness of breathing or pranayama practice, qigong practice, that you learn how to harmonize your breath energy. And then at the same time, that's working with emotions also. Okay, and so then the Shen is the heart mind, and the way you lose that, or the way that gets lost, is you're caught up in conceptual thinking.
Okay.
And so the experience when you're meditating that your mind wanders off in the thought, that's your Shen getting depleted. Your heart mind is getting depleted because you're getting caught up in the thoughts. Whereas through stillness, through letting go, you come back into the heart mind. You come back into this experience of presence itself, and then that's how that Shen, the heart mind, gets cultivated or developed. And when that Shen is getting cultivated, then the qi sublimates into the Shen. So then you have this experience then of all three levels of that energy merging together and becoming one unified energy. And so that's how you get into these deeper levels of meditative absorption or trance.
Wow.
And when we talk about the experience of awakening, when you're around an awakened being, there's another threshold that they've gone beyond, where the Shen is sublimated to, however you want to call it, the ground of being, nirvana, the Tao.
Oh, wow.
The non-dual ground of being.
So moving from an intuition grounded in that is going to be far more in the flow of what truly is than through some conceptual filter.
Yeah, you're fully down.
Yeah, fully down.
Yeah, exactly.
In the ground of being. Yeah,
right.
Wow.
You can't get you cannot get any further down.
Nice. So I guess that's what it would really mean to truly move from the heart space, is to really be all the way down and embodied into all that is.
Right, and then that there can be, so the way of devotion, the bhakti marga path, right?
Yep.
Or love, or the desire for awakening, is this deep, heartfelt experience that is a purifying expression that's coming from deep within you, that's not your ego. It's this deeper level of love and yearning for this awakening. So the experience of love or devotion is directly related to the heart mind and that experience of awakening.
I love that. And maybe that's why there's so much, as we were talking about maybe before we started recording, there was overlap between the Bhakti and the Buddhist movements and the Ram Dass satsang, and
right.
There's so much of this overlap. That was something else I kind of wanted to ask you about. Your time as a Buddhist monk was split up in France and studying in the monastery, but you also spent time in India with Hindu teachers.
Yeah.
So the difference between orthodoxy and orthopraxy was introduced to me only recently in an interfaith ritual class. But in my mind, I kind of avoided a lot of traditions because I thought, well, I have to believe it 100% in order to be a part of that group.
Yeah.
And I don't believe anything 100%, so I can't even participate.
Yeah.
Whereas I come to find out later, if you just follow the rules of that group, you're allowed to think whatever you want.
Yeah.
And that's something that really kind of blew my mind. So I guess I would love to hear you just talk a little bit about what it was like to be a Buddhist monk practicing in India with Hindu teachers.
Yeah. Well, again, even before I was a monk, when I was at Vassar, I was learning how to meditate at Zen Mountain Monastery. And then the summer after I can't remember. The summer after college, I was in Europe, and I was with Mother Meera, who's a guru from India that lives in Germany.
Yeah.
And so, I had like a real deep experience being in her presence. And it was just her presence was the main thing. It wasn't like when you go see her, she does darshan, you sit in a room for maybe 2 hours and it's completely silent. And then one by one, you go up and she touches your head and then looks in your eyes.
Yeah.
And so I was there for 2 weeks. And so during that 2-week period, I had like what I would call like kind of a brief opening to this deeper ground of being. And so that took place completely within silence and presence. There was no teaching.
Yeah.
Like
the Ramana Maharshi lineage
right.
you also studied within.
Right. And then after, maybe a year later, I was, my girlfriend, who actually became my fiance, and then she actually ordained with me. She became a nun, I became a monk.
Yeah, you guys did that instead of the marriage thing.
Right.
Different kind of vows.
She had already spent time in India with Amachi, so I saw Amachi in New Mexico and Texas. And so again, so being with Mother Meera, being with Amachi, being with Thich Nhat Hanh, to me it's like the same basic experience of I'm around someone who's reached some level of very deep awakening, and just their being itself is radiating this powerful energy field of bliss, transcendence, while at the same time very in the present moment, very grounded. And so for me, it's like I'm just relating to three different human beings and having very much a similar kind of experience.
Yeah.
And so whatever words you want to put on top of it is secondary. Like that's just the packaging or whatever.
Yeah.
So for me, it's, and then so yeah, I later on got into Ramana Maharishi's teachings. So for me, yeah, that the teachings from Ramana Maharishi to me are, I guess, like I would count as like a perennial viewpoint, perennial philosophy, meaning there's like one mountaintop and different paths to get to the top.
Yeah.
Yeah. And some will argue, oh, well, there's more than one mountaintop. Which my response is, if I ever get to the point where I have to make a choice between one mountaintop or the other, I'll consider myself in a pretty good space.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
all I know is I got to get from here. I got to get somewhere. And so for me, the teachings of Buddhism, especially like early Buddhist, Thai forest interpretation of early Buddhism, Chan Buddhism, Japanese Zen Buddhism, Thich Nhat Hanh, Mother Mira, Amachi, Ramana Maharishi, Ram Dass, all of them, even getting into the Yoga Sutras, like all of them, I think are all pointing to the same experience of awakening to this ground of being. That's the goal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that there's people that have had, to one degree or another, an awakening or a realization of that, which causes a radical transformation. And when you're around them, you have this experience of this, whatever you want to call it, some powerful experience when you're around them. Yeah.
Yeah. What was, I guess, I'm just trying to visualize the situation. And I guess I wonder if you had any conflict representing a tradition that has somewhat strict Vinaya, the rule, your monastic code that you're supposed to follow. India can be sometimes difficult for different reasons. Did you get any pushback from your own community for doing that? Did you encounter any difficulties while you're in India, or going back and forth? I know you came back to teach meditation to earn some funds to go back. Any difficulties?
Yeah, I mean, it was just like the Thich Nhat Hanh community definitely, at least in the beginning when he was ordaining people, he started ordaining people sometime in the 80s or 90s.
Okay.
And there was a general intention that you stay with the community the rest of your life.
Yeah. And
you don't go to another community. And that's the form that he wanted to present. But if you look at Buddhism in general in different countries in Asia, it's not uncommon that you might start with one teacher, but then you move around to other teachers. You may spend a certain formative period where, like, say, the first 5 or 6 years you're supposed to be with one teacher just to get solidified, but then after that, okay, you can stay or you can go. It's up to you. Mm-hmm. So when I left, the Thich Nhat Hanh was saying, oh, you shouldn't go. And people in the community were saying, oh, either you shouldn't go or we don't want you to go. And I was basically like, okay, maybe I shouldn't go, but like maybe it's wrong for me to go, but I gotta go.
Yeah. So, you gotta move from that heart space, right?
Right. And so it's an ongoing experiment whether I should have gone or not. But when I was in India, I was with Lakshmana Swami and Sri Saradama. So Lakshmana Swami is a guru who was with Ramana Maharishi, and according to his autobiography, he became realized in Ramana's presence when he was young, like 20-something. And then Saradama knew him from when she was a little girl, and according to her autobiography, she became realized in Lakshmana Swami's presence when she was, like, I think around 18.
Okay.
And he basically adopted her as his daughter. And so all of these gurus who I've been with have never had sex. They've always been celibate. They never had sex. And then, again, Thich Nhat Hanh doesn't openly say what level of awakening he's reached.
Yeah.
So, but from my perspective, what they all have in common is that they're pretty deeply realized beings, and one way of, I don't know, it just so happens that none of them ever had sex, and not for all of their students, but for some of their students, they recommend that you be celibate, because that is considered like the process of awakening will happen more quickly if you do that.
I know if I never tasted a cookie before,
right,
I would be curious about what a cookie tastes like,
right.
But I wouldn't occasionally get that sugar craving in that same way. Like, I want that specific flavor.
Yeah.
I can imagine there's something to having a different sense of peace of mind of having never had that awakened in such a way.
And so these gurus I was with, they were very informal. There was no, you didn't become a monastic with them. You just either were spending time with them or not. But there was no ceremony or rules or whatever.
Well, in India, there's different levels of guru, right?
Yeah.
And so I imagine these are as you said, the awakened beings who are the way, and you just hang out in their presence versus the other kind of a guru who's more of a teacher who teaches you formal practices or initiates you into a lineage. Yeah. And then there's the less formal kind of just means teacher.
Yeah.
They generally teach you. So there's these different levels of guru that people aren't always aware of, I think, in the West.
Yeah.
So it's important, I think, to make that distinction.
Yeah. And so it was very informal, but then having said that, there was this organic recognition of celibacy as being a good thing for those who were ready for it. For others, that wasn't their karma. So there were actually other Buddhist monks and nuns with these gurus besides just me. There's like 3 or 4 from Korea that were with these teachers.
Oh, cool.
And so there was a general, like in Buddhism, we talk about the fourfold Sangha of monks, nuns, laymen, and laywomen. So when I was with these gurus, there was a general understanding of men and women, celibate, non-celibate. And so, in other words, I was supported to be a monk.
Yeah.
When I was around them, and I was seen as a monk around them. So it was like, it was the ecosystem knew what this was and was supporting it. Yeah.
Yeah, you're in the homeland of the tradition, I guess. It's not surprising to me that it's understood there, and they've got a place for spiritual seekers there to be differentiated in their own unique ways. Whereas here in the West, we might be a little bit more touchy about how we make that distinction. Yeah,
and so it's not seen as like you're weird or you're just suppressing something or so I think I think both cultures can learn from each other.
Oh, absolutely.
So, and there's some people that become celibate because they got some stuff they need to work out that they're running away from, and actually they should stay in touch with their sexual energy because they need to work something out.
What does Ram Dass say? Ram Dass says there's no use in running around as a horny celibate.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Like, also, don't force yourself to meditate when it's naturally arising. Then you're going to do it. But doing it because you think you ought to is a recipe for disaster.
Right. So I guess what I feel is missing in Western culture, though, is an understanding of, yes, this full, deep level of awakening is possible. It's a completely different category of experience. And so I guess just the limit of what's possible, I feel like in the West is not fully recognized. And so I feel like we can get into this weird situation where people are put up on pedestals and we think that's the ultimate, and really, no, that's not the ultimate. That's just like
one of the cool steps along the way.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I think that Western science is trying to do more analyzing of some of these psychic phenomenon or deeper states of consciousness, like the overlap between quantum physics and consciousness studies is exciting, and so I think the gap is starting to be bridged as the West comes up to the deeper understanding that the East has had for some time. Yeah, it's interesting to watch.
And so my research, I'm interested in that crossover between Buddhism and psychotherapy. So I feel like one of the insights Western culture has brought about is awareness of abuse and awareness of the need for a space. So if you go see a therapist that's outside your normal social circle, it's completely confidential. And you can talk directly about issues about abuse. Right. So maybe that has always been there in Buddhism informally, but it's not. You don't see it explicitly talked about or dealt with. Right. I mean, there may be some trauma of a natural disaster or something, but there's not like dealing with issues of abuse. Like that's not explicitly talked about.
It seems like throughout most of history, from my understanding, like it's just that's not acknowledged. You don't talk about family abuse, like sexual or violent or whatever. Like it's just a matter of fact, and we don't talk about it. Right. And it seems like that's across the board everywhere in all cultures.
And I don't know, maybe like in one of the social ethics class I teach on the 5 precepts, we get into indigenous cultures, and there's this book, Sharing Our Stories of Survival, about Native American women survivors of sexual abuse, and talking about how pre-colonial contact there just wasn't as much abuse going on because their society had deeper respect for women and had like a worldview that was respecting women and the earth, and there was just less abuse, period. And maybe that's not true for all indigenous cultures in the U.S., but they point to specific ones where they feel like they have evidence of that, you know. So, so I always hesitate to say that the West has invented something new that hadn't been there before, but we can say, relatively speaking, psychotherapy has provided a space, or it's opened a door where certain things can be dealt with that previously were not dealt with. And from my experience, at least in Buddhism, as a monastic and studying the text and things, that's a missing piece. And,
I can see that.
So, okay, Western culture doesn't fully get the nirvana thing, but there is a recognition of this interpersonal thing that is very important, and so I'm interested in the best of both, like integrating the best of both.
It seems like you're doing a pretty good job incorporating those modalities. We're in such an interesting time right now. I think because everybody has a voice, the voice of dissent is allowed to come to the surface, and so we can challenge our authority figures and our paradigms that have been just so blanketly accepted in the past. And then we have access to all the modalities, and so we're able to easily cross-identify similarities between psychotherapy and Buddhism because we just have access to all that information. So it's such an interesting time, and although it is getting darker in some ways, I think the potential for healing and growth is greater than it has ever been because of that access to information. It's really interesting. So maybe that kind of brings us in to the paper.
So,
right?
So I think that's there's the nirvana transcendent. There's the interpersonal. Like psychotherapy is like mainly dealing with like individuals and interpersonal suffering. And then I think there's a third area, which would be the collective social justice area.
Yeah.
So we could think of these as three different zones that overlap with each other. And so a big argument can be made is that psychotherapy has not dealt with the social justice level of suffering, that it's kept its focus on the individual and not dealt with collective issues of social justice.
Even within the social programs, I'm just thinking at a glance right now, it seems like individually geared. Like for example, when you were going and working with incarcerated peoples, you were going and teaching the group, but it was kind of for their own individual benefits, right?
Yeah,
rather than addressing, you're not talking to the staff and getting them to change their practices as an institution.
Right.
You're talking to the incarcerated people individually.
That's very much something I'm interested in. Basically I'm going in as a Buddhist teacher teaching Buddhism, and I'll talk a little bit about racism and stuff, but so if the new Jim Crow sheet, Michelle Alexander talks about how prisons are basically like the continuation of slavery, right?
Yeah.
So it's like they're plantations, basically. And I'm like a minister walking onto a plantation. And so, during the Civil War, you had Quaker ministers who were abolitionists who would go to plantations and might meet with the slave owner and or the slaves, but depending on the particular situation, they may or may not be able to openly talk about what
they
want to talk about.
Yeah.
So I taught in a maximum security prison for 4 years, and I was just, at the beginning, I was just talking about Buddhism, and in other words, I wasn't trying to form the equivalent of a Buddhist Black Panther Party in the prison.
Yeah.
But I'm very interested in the idea of what would a Buddhist Black Panther movement be?
Yeah.
Where it's a religious-based organization that's working inside the prison and outside the prison. There's a spiritual cultivation aspect to it, and there's very much a social justice aspect to it.
That sounds like fire. I like it. That sounds so good.
Right. So that, and I'm just this white guy talking about it, right? So
work with what you got.
Right. So this article, The Dependent Origination of Whiteness, what is white supremacy from a Buddhist perspective? Yeah,
Yeah, what is white supremacy from a Buddhist perspective? Yeah, so I'd like to also share the name and the little bio about the journal that you published in, because as I was considering what to do with my life before I decided to go back to school, I was starting to just learn more and more. And when I discovered online academic journals, I was like, oh wow, I don't have to read Wikipedia to get my info. I can read what actual scholars are doing. So the world of academic journals really kind of changed my ability to access information. And I was grateful for the opportunity to discover this journal through your paper, because I poked around on their website a little bit, and they've got some really cool stuff on there. So I'm just going to read their bio real quick. So Kalfu is a journal of comparative and relational ethnic studies. Tagline out the bag. But on their About page, it says Kalfu is a scholarly journal focused on social movements, social institutions, and social relations. They seek to build links among intellectuals, artists, and activists in shared struggles for social justice. The journal seeks to promote the development of community-based scholarship in ethnic studies among humanists and social scientists, and to connect the specialized knowledge produced from academe to the situated knowledge generated in aggrieved communities. Kalfu is published by Temple University Press on behalf of the UCSB Center for Black Studies Research. So right off the bat, wow, they're doing some pretty cool work, bringing different communities and different levels of scholarship together. And I think it's really cool that you were able to publish within that journal.
Yeah, so George Lipsitz, he's the editor. So as part of my PhD coursework at Claremont School of Theology, I took a class at Claremont Graduate University that was taught by Susan Phillips, she's a professor at Pitzer College, but she taught a class at CGU. It's kind of complicated, but anyway. So she taught a class on the prison industrial complex and the prison abolition movement.
Wow.
So her research is, she did this whole ethnographic research of gangs in LA, and so it was a class on prison abolition, and so by then I had already started teaching in prison, and I wanted to learn more about the prison system and the abolition movement. So again, that connection between slavery and prison industrial complex. So they're using the term abolition of slavery, and now it's abolition of prisons
in general, not just private prisons. Like California just passed this law a couple days ago. Today's the 21st of September. We're recording this, so a couple days ago they passed a law saying they were going to ban private prisons, or just not renew their contracts next year. Actually, But so we're not talking about that. We're talking about all prisons. So moving away from a model of punishment to rehabilitation, I imagine. So that. I mean, the statistics of how we incarcerate way more people than any other country, and there's different ways you can look at it, but like from a Marxist perspective, you could say that basically with neoliberalism, the manufacturing jobs left the U.S., so then now you have this big surplus labor force, which a lot of them happen to be people of color, and there's nowhere for them to go. There's no jobs for them. So then the system criminalized them, and then this prison industrial complex is what came out of it. So what I say is white supremacy is a system of extractivism, and it's extracting land, labor, and life force. So you can think during the original settler colonial time, it's extracting land from Native Americans, it's extracting labor from African Americans, it's extracting life force from both. And so you could look at the prison industrial complex as a way of extracting from black and brown bodies. It's a way of extracting wealth from their life force. Like literally you put them in a box and you turn that into money for people on the top. And the state.
Right. So then so the general idea is that the system of white supremacy has created this situation where you have this dehumanizing system and this hierarchical system, and then that's the prison is a manifestation of that. Whereas, like, if we had a different system altogether that provided education, that provided housing, that provided healthcare, that redefined what the goals of the society should be about, then there would be no need for the prison. The prison is serving a function that could be met in a different way. So if we spend all the money we spend on prisons, on schools, education, healthcare, say now the Green New Deal, if we spend all of the money, if we cut the military budget, and that's the other thing, is that the military is the other side of the prison system. So the foreign policy and the domestic policy are both based on extractivism. If we cut the military budget and the prison budget and then use all that money for, say, a just Green New Deal, like climate justice, and for reparations, then, there would be no need for prisons. So the prison abolition movement is saying we don't need prisons, we need, like, a new society.
Totally. Yeah, and I think you mentioned some of those, like the solutions towards the end of your article, of reinvesting in those communities.
Right.
Because essentially we're criminalizing poverty, and then that's what the prison ends up being. It's the punishment for being poor and not having the means to supporting yourself, which is why people turn to quote-unquote crime.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So reinvesting back in the communities, it sounds like a plausible solution to the supposed problems that we're having with crime.
And I think as well dealing with issues of addiction and trauma. And again,
which
we're
are also
talking,
criminalized in this system. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And again, we can talk about addiction and trauma on an individual level, but we can also talk about it on a collective level. And we can talk about trauma as, again, how Marie Watkins and Helene Schulman, that trauma can be victim, bystander, or perpetrator.
Mm-hmm.
So we can say for sure that people of color have been experiencing victim trauma, and then white supremacists are experiencing perpetrator trauma. And the way that they're acting it out is to keep doing things that are traumatizing.
Yeah.
So it's a system that requires dissociation, dehumanization. It's a system that requires that you get cut off from your own embodied experience.
Mm-hmm.
And so then to undo the system means that everyone involved has to be able to get back in touch with their embodied experience and deal with the trauma that's there, so that then we can rehumanize ourselves, and then the experience of being together as one collective can happen. Whereas the way it is now, whether you're an overt white supremacist or just a white person who's got implicit bias, and you voted for Trump, or like, well, for example, like Medicare for all, a single healthcare system would mean we're all one body, sharing one body together.
Yeah.
So that's the equivalent of like someone who's had trauma getting back into their body, and then this trauma comes up and you got to release it so you can be back in your body. So for us to have like a collective healthcare system would mean collectively we have to get back into our body, and then that means the trauma that's there has to be dealt with.
Yeah, but nobody wants to put their hand in the fire, right? Nobody wants to experience that pain, and I think that's the point, right? We keep turning away from that pain, so we perpetuate it and make it worse and stuff it down and and perpetuate that suffering for ourselves and the supposed other.
And this, I mean, for people who are the target group or experiencing most of the victim trauma, they're already feeling the pain. Yeah. So for them, the pain is not new.
Absolutely.
So then, the people that are in the perpetrator group, part of the system that allows the perpetrator pattern to keep happening is this dissociation or being out of touch with the pain that's there.
Hmm. You give some really nice concrete examples in your article. You talk very specifically about what dependent origination is, which maybe we should say that. But then, you give some really nice concrete examples of how it manifests in the mind of the European American that allows us to continue holding on to this sense of whiteness. You want to talk a little bit about the specifics of maybe one of those examples and maybe what dependent origination is in a nutshell? Yeah.
So in Buddhism, the Four Noble Truths, there's suffering. It's caused by craving. It's possible for the cessation of suffering to happen. The way you do that is you engage in a path of practice that involves keeping ethical precepts, developing stability of body and mind through meditation, and then processing stored up intense material. And so the second noble truth, the cause of suffering, is seen, craving is one link in a chain. And there's different, if you look at the Buddhist teaching for the Pali Canon, there'll be chains with different numbers of links.
Mm-hmm.
but it's called say the 12 links of dependent origination, or the 6 links of dependent origination. And so what it's saying then is it's this cycle that keeps happening over and over again. And so I like to use the 6 link chain. And so basically it's saying it's these 6 links that keep circling around. And so the 6 links are, the first link is I have a body and mind. The second link is that there's contact between my body and mind and the outside world, meaning I see something, I hear something, I smell something, or I think something.
Yeah.
Because in Buddhism, thought is seen as just another sense space.
Yeah.
That contact gives rise to sensation, meaning body sensation, which can be pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral.
Mm-hmm.
And so if it's pleasant sensation, it tends to give rise to craving. If it's unpleasant, it tends to give rise to aversion.
Yeah.
If it's neutral, it can tend to give rise to spaced out, like you're not aware that it's even happening. Okay, so say it's a pleasant sensation, it gives rise to craving, and then you act on the craving. That's the next link, which is grasping. And then once you've acted on it, it's like the karmic wheel is in motion and you can't pull it back. So then the 6th link, which is becoming, you become or are reborn into a new body and mind that is experiencing the results of the karma that you just acted on.
Nice. I really, it was a game changer for me when I heard you explain rebirth in this form of constantly becoming anew in every moment.
Right.
Somebody cuts you off in traffic, you are reborn as an angry person who honks at them.
Right.
So it really gave a new secular application to what people often dismiss as too much woo-woo of the spirituality of rebirth.
Right.
Yeah, so body, mind, contact, sensation, craving, grasping, becoming. So how does that work in terms of whiteness?
Right. Okay. So so a mundane example is I'm at my workplace, so my body and mind is there, and then somebody yells at me, so my ears make contact with somebody's voice. It gives rise to an unpleasant sensation in my body, and then I have the craving to yell back at the person.
Yeah.
Or so aversion. And then if I act on it, if I yell at the person, then I'm reborn as someone who's yelled at that person. So basically I've identified with the anger and the action that the anger is propelling me to do, and then I've acted on it. And so the general idea is that when you act out on craving and aversion, there may be some short-term temporary high, but then it leads to a crash. It leads to ultimately you're depleted, or you've caused suffering or disharmony. And so it may feel good in the moment to yell back at the person, but then you've created a whole mess, and you regret it later. And that's different from so that's different from being present with the body sensation that comes up. And if it's an intense body sensation that's pleasant or unpleasant, like learning how to be with it through practice. So through awareness of breathing, awareness of body sensation, and practice, you learn how to be with the sensation. And then that way you can let go of the craving or the aversion. You don't have to fall into the reaction.
So a skilled practitioner would notice those sensations arising, acknowledge them, even sit with them potentially until they dissipated on their own, not necessarily reject or let go of them in a disassociative way, but allow them to be embodied, acknowledge their source, acknowledge the deeper reality of the situation, and that you don't need to react to it. And that awareness alone, at least in my experience, just bringing that up for myself gives the sensation more space, and it naturally, much of the time, not all the time, tends to dissipate on its own.
Yeah, and which is what somatic trauma therapy is saying. The same thing is that Peter Levine somatic experiencing, he says you want to decouple the sensation from the reactive emotion.
Yes.
So when trauma is coming up, you're experiencing it as intense body sensation as well as intense reactive emotions of rage or fear.
Yeah, you're adding all these thoughts to what the sensation is, and you're ascribing all these qualities to it and justifying all your feelings, and
and it's the whole biochemical thing. So you're like parts of your brain are getting activated that are very deep level instinctual responses, right? So so the practice is, to be aware of, oh, wait a minute, there's a difference between the body sensation and the emotion. So first, just being able to make a distinction between the two.
Totally. And
then that it is possible to be with the sensation and not be overwhelmed by it. And this is where it gets tricky, because when trauma comes up, sometimes there's a particular part of the brain that makes you literally feel like you're going to die come up. You feel that in your body, in your emotion, in your mind, I'm going to die. It feels like you're going to die.
Well, it's an evolutionary trait that's helped us survive in the past, right? So it's built in.
Right. So, and this, it gets into, they talk about like the new mammal part of the brain, the old mammal part of the brain, and the reptile part of the brain. And, but anyway, the point being, it's very powerful, intense sensations and very powerful reactive emotions. And the idea around the practice is to develop awareness and equanimity with the sensations so that you can then let go of the reactive emotions. And what that means then is you're not pushed into a reaction.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then when you're able to be with the sensations as they are, then there can be a stabilizing, a grounding, and then, a dissipation of the energy, a calming, a going back down. And if the situation does call for a response, an authentic response can arise that you can act on that is good for you and the everybody involved. So you may be in a situation that does actually call for an extremely strong response, of maybe even a strong physical action. But it's coming from this place of awareness and equanimity that's aware of the interbeing or the interdependent experience of what's going on. And that is coming from wisdom and compassion, and that's trying to create a situation of harmony or balance. And so depending on the context, so I guess my point being that what I'm talking about doesn't mean you just become completely passive, or that there's not a difference between healthy anger that's channeled through wisdom and compassion as a force for justice. That is actually one of the outcomes we do want to cultivate, is that's a wholesome karma that we do want to grow and make stronger.
Yeah.
But so we're distinguishing between those things. So then in the paper, I just imagine myself as a white colonial settler. So I imagine, basically I talk about like how Europeans were reborn as white supremacist Americans through the process of native genocide and African enslavement.
Yeah.
And there's scholarship saying that even within Europe before colonialism, they had some fucked up dynamics going on that this is a continuation. But in this particular moment, this is the birth of whiteness as we know it. So I'm a European, say from England, and I make my body and mind is on the land of what we now call the United States. Okay, and so then my body and mind sees all this land. So I make contact with the image of the land in front of me, and that gives rise to this pleasant sensation like, wow, all this land. And then there's the craving of, I want that land. And then there's me acting out, I take possession of that land, and then now I'm reborn as I am the person that owns this land.
Yeah.
Okay? So then in that process, I see Native Americans on that land. So my eyes make contact with Native Americans, and that gives rise to this unpleasant sensation of they're on the land that I want.
Yep.
So I want to get rid of them. I have an aversion. I have an unpleasant sensation, and then there's an aversion.
Yeah.
Okay, so now closely related to these 6 links is this experience of ignorance. So it's kind of like another layer that's adding into it. The main thing is the body sensation and the emotion. But adding into it is these thought patterns. And so basically there has to be a thought pattern that allows me to dehumanize the person that I'm about to inflict some kind of violence or extractivism on. And what I'm saying is, in the process of dehumanizing the other, I'm also dehumanizing myself. So it's almost like there's a mini version of the 6th link that happens where I, in my body and mind, make contact with the idea that I'm a white person who's Christian and superior, and that Native American is a non-white person who's not Christian and inferior. And then that gives pleasant sensation in me, so then I identify with that identity, that thought pattern. So there's almost like a mini rebirth that happens right there in my head. So now I'm reborn in my head as a white person.
Well, that seems like the ground of justification for all the horrible immigration policies and foreign wars and creating the demonized other.
Yeah. Okay. So the way I'm defining extractivism as a dominating group or a perpetrator group extracting the land, labor, and or life force from a target group. Mm-hmm. And then that requires then that the perpetrator group dehumanize the target group as well as dehumanize themselves. So then I do this little mini mental dehumanizing, and that prepares me then for the actual act of violence of killing the Native Americans or pushing them off their land. Mm-hmm. So that's a much deeper, more intense level experience, which is going to bring about a much deeper level of trauma. So once I have seen the Native American, it's given rise to this aversion, the desire to kill the Native American, and then I act on that desire and I actually kill the Native American, then I'm really reborn as a white person, and I'm really buying into they are a less than human person that it doesn't matter if they kill them or not.
Yeah.
So now I'm reborn as a white person, and then when I think back on that experience, that is a major trauma experience. To kill someone is a major traumatizing experience. So if I think back on it, or if I see more Native Americans, that trauma is going to come up as very intense body sensation. So there's contact, either I see something or I think something. And so that past trauma caused by my past perpetrator violence is going to come up in the form of intense body sensation and intense emotion.
Yeah.
And if I'm not able to be with that, and basically some kind of truth and reconciliation process within myself, okay, then I'm going to need to double down on the dehumanizing, dissociating identity of whiteness as a way to escape that body sensation. I got to trip out big time into my head and like check out from the body experience.
Yeah.
And so then I'm a really fucking white person, and then I'm left with this empty hole of a shell of a being inside, and now I got to fill up that hole. So then that hole's got to get filled up with some kind of intense addictive craving.
Which is the escapism that we turn to in some myriad ways.
Right. So either addiction and or a way of using religion to dissociate and or further extractivism of land, labor, and life force from people of color to gain some sensual pleasure. I'm extracting pleasure from the target group. I'm dehumanizing the target group and extracting pleasure from them in order to escape the trauma that I have inside of me.
That's a hell of a hamster wheel you got yourself on there, buddy.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so I was kind of struck by the paper because that's, I guess, the big point of it all. This is the ongoing process of whiteness today. Right. I thought the paper might be more about the historical precedent for how we got to where we are today, which, as we talked about a little bit, you do cover and give that background, but it is more about this ongoing process of perpetuating this state of this state of whiteness through this disassociation and perpetuating this this sense of dehumanizing the other.
Right. That the process of rebirth is happening now. So it's the same. Yeah. It's the same dynamic that was happening then. The mechanics of it are the same.
Except now it's got like 400 years of
right. Now, we've
momentum.
Built up a big, and if
it's going to take a lot more healing circles than it would have back then.
Right. The level of collective trauma that's been built up, and now it's become planetary. Now, now we've reached. If you read that quote at the beginning of the paper, I quote George Lipschitz. I'll read it. Okay, so this is what George is saying. The white identity conditioned to fear the Asian menace owes its origin to the history of anti-Indian, anti-black, and anti-Mexican racism at home, as well as to anti-Arab and anti-Latino racism shaped by military struggles overseas and by condescending cultural stereotypes at home. White racism is a pathology looking for a place to land, sadism in search of a story. So we can look at whiteness then as this ongoing process of rebirth that's it's looking for a target group to dehumanize and extract from. It wants to extract pleasure, and it also wants to inflict violence. Mm-hmm. It wants to do both. Yeah.
Wow. So how do we go about, so someone like you and I, we're interested in pulling out and uprooting our own inherent biases and picking this stuff apart. But a lot of people are still deeply entrenched in their identity of being a white person. Yeah. They're really invested in extractivist mentality. I've had difficulty engaging with other white-presenting people. Mm-hmm. I guess there's instead of calling out, there's this idea of call-in culture. We want to call people in, but sometimes it's hard to even engage with it. So, like, I have two examples of maybe it's kind of ridiculous, but people on Facebook, they made jokes, insensitive jokes. They were both Black Lives Matters jokes. Yeah. One of them went out and had a big meal, and he made a joke and said #FatLivesMatter. Yeah. It's like, okay, well, I think I gotta say something. So I was like, I just had to point out that it was insensitive and bringing down the efficacy of the movement and yada yada. And this person was offended because he's actually half Mexican, and so he just focused on the fact that I was saying as a white person we can't do this, whatever. And he's like, well, I'm not white. Yeah. And so he didn't even want to engage with the issues. Yeah. The other person made a joke. She went out and did some drinking, and she made a joke, #DrunkWivesMatter. Right. So again, same thing. And so she was like, I don't even want to be political. I'll just take down the post. Yeah. So I mean, it was just Facebook, so it's not the appropriate place to engage with people necessarily. Yeah. But even in person, I have a difficult time engaging with people who are making insensitive jokes and or saying things that are deeply biased from a superior privileged point of view. Yeah. So how I wonder if you have any input in how we can even bring this topic up to other white presenting people and the greater communities. Yeah. Well,
I think the first thing is just being aware how deep it is, and that from what at least the lens I'm looking through is that we are dealing with trauma. Like, it is trauma that we are dealing with. And so then the somatic trauma therapy approaches that I'm interested in and that I feel like have a lot of overlap with Buddhism, these somatic trauma therapy approaches understand that when you're working with trauma, just working on the level of concepts and thought and the thinking mind and the rational mind is not going to get the job done. It won't get into the deep level healing and transformation that has to happen, because you're dealing again with these primal forces of the limbic system and the brainstem, and So I think one thing, the white liberal mistake is to think, oh, we just need to have rational discussions and then that's what will fix everything. And it's like, no, it's not. It goes down much deeper than that. So the rational discussion can help to frame things, but what we're really talking about is this deeper level of body-mind experience. And so in trauma therapy as well as in Buddhist practice, the idea is you first have to establish stability and then you work with material. You don't go straight to the material and try and work with it before the stability has been established. So I think the first benefit of this analysis is at least we can understand the depth of what's going on.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not sitting here saying I know all that's going on. I'm not saying this has completely figured everything out. But
it's one study amongst many,
right.
many. Yeah, there's a lot of work being done.
But it helps us not underestimate the depth of what we're dealing with.
Yeah.
And so then, the process of getting out of it is going to be a very long, in-depth process. And it's, so there's general strategies in trauma therapy, like you start with the body and then the emotion and then the thought pattern. You don't start with the thought pattern and then the emotion and then the body sensation, because then you'll just end up stirring up a memory and re-traumatizing yourself, and you won't actually be healing. You'll just be re-traumatizing yourself.
Yeah. So I'm hearing that it's not necessarily going to be effective for me to engage with people at this level of conversation. Well, you still got to call it out. But I guess also I want to interject to ask, like, I would never force somebody to deal with their trauma. I would never.
Right.
Like, somebody has to be willing and able and willing participant in their own healing to get anything done.
Right.
So maybe by just calling people out, it's less than helpful as it would be to maybe invite them to look more deeply or meet somebody where they're at and have them take a bit of useful information so they can reflect on it if they want to, so they can engage in some of this deeper somatic healing. Right.
Yeah, it's a weird. We're in this crisis moment, right, where if we don't heal from our trauma, we're going to bring the whole planet down.
Yeah.
So, and so then it's like, okay, who are the European Americans who are willing and able right now to do deeper level work? And okay, let's start doing that work. Okay.
Because it will blossom and it ripples, and I think that's part of what I'm doing on this podcast is that I don't want to tell anybody what they need to do to better themselves. But if I can just be an example of how I've healed, if somebody's into that and they want to pick up on it, cool. Like it's out there and it's free for them to take it or leave it.
So I think that's one level. Is okay. Let's get people who are willing and able. Let's start doing a collective healing process that involves contemplative practice and trauma therapy and education around history and social injustice, and let's do it. Okay. Then I think this analysis helps us understand how Trump got elected, why you have these like mass shootings, like basically white terrorist mass shootings. That's intense level of trauma acting itself out.
Yeah.
So it at least helps us understand, okay, that's what's happening. And so then it helps us be able to we can predict behavior a little better. I mean,
that makes sense.
By nature of the beast, it's unpredictable because it's trauma, but it's like a controlled crash. Like, okay, we know that there's a certain segment of the population now that is highly traumatized and acting out or about to act out. And so we understand that that's what that is, and we don't underestimate what that is. And then we can be more ready then to... It's almost like I feel like we have to create containers or structures that will predict that that is what's going to happen, that a certain segment is going to freak out and form militias or white terrorist acts or whatever. And so then the rest of us have to come together. So say Democratic Socialists of America have to have a plan for like dealing with white violence. I mean, like what is if Bernie gets elected and he's in power and he's in charge of the armed forces and white militias are going off, what is the plan to deal with that?
That's a tricky one.
And what if within the military itself elements go off? What's the plan to deal with that?
That's a very realistic question. Like,
right.
I mean, the way I see it next year, like when the election goes off, one way or another, like, ooh, it's looking scary. Like,
right.
I'm worried about it, but
right. So there's Judith Herman, who is one of the she's like one of the godmothers of trauma therapy. She and Bandy Lee co-wrote a book called The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, and they talk about Bandy Lee. Her whole career is based on dealing with psychopathic, violent people. Like that's her job. I think she's at Yale or she deals with the psychopathic people like in prisons and the people that should be in prison.
So I'm seeing in your article here,
right.
She's the former director of the research for the Center for the Study of Violence.
Right.
And you give this great analogy of, quote, ordinarily we carry out a routine process for treating people who are dangerous, containment, removal from access to weapons, and an urgent evaluation. And you give this analogy of the father who's violent in the household and
right, and
applying that to our collective situation. I thought that was really a good way to illustrate the situation.
Yeah, and so it's a kind of down and dirty way of trying to explain something. So it's falling under the idea of like a nuclear family with traditional gender roles and things. So take it with a grain of salt. But the idea is Trump and the neoliberal far right wing, the Republican Party is basically the father in the family who is abusing the wife and the children in the family. The Democrats are basically the mom in the family who's enabling the father to keep doing the violence.
Yeah.
And then the children are the young people, the people of color, the people who are in the target groups who have to suffer under the rule of these parents. And so I'm very interested in how this idea of microcosm and macrocosm, right? So how does a family that's dealing with domestic violence, how does that situation get dealt with? What are the strategies of dealing with that? And then now what from that strategy or skill set can apply to the collective level of what we're dealing with? So then if you think a presidential debate on the debate stage, how do you like call out what's going on, you make the direct parallel.
Yeah. It's such a shit show up there, though. It's like, how do you do that? I don't know. You start with a new group of 10.
Well,
but I hear you.
And this,
I hear you.
again, and this is where it gets dangerous, is like, when do you actively push somebody's button to bring them down? Because it's for the greater good. So, like, the idea of if you could kill Hitler, that would be a good thing to do because, right? So...
That's what you think, but then is the second in power going to be twice as bad?
Right.
Like, you never know. Like, if we took out Trump, would Pence be way worse?
Right. So again, I'm not saying we should. I'm not saying we should shoot Trump.
Playing with fire here.
But what I'm saying is,
remove the violent father.
Right. Call it what it really is. That this is a traumatized, abusive authority figure in power that's wreaking havoc and needs to be have his weapons removed, and he needs to be contained. Yeah. As like just the first step. And so like that's like a big task of what we're going to have to do. Yeah. And then the family goes off and then they do their own healing work. And you say the father can engage in that healing if he wants to from afar, separate from the group. Right, yeah. And this, I mean, I don't know enough about family therapy and how it works, but I was just imagining this is just like a thought experiment of like, okay, first of all, the father has to be removed from the family, meaning the Republicans have to be voted out of power. They have to be removed from power so that they can't cause any further harm. Yeah. Right? And then the Democrats that are still trying to court the center, basically it's neoliberalism with a veneer of multiculturalism on top. Mm-hmm. That's also a big, huge chunk of the problem, and that also has to be removed from power. Yeah, I agree. That the Green New Deal really does have to happen, that we really do have to get off fossil fuels, that the certain sense of urgency is not a joke. It's not to be toyed with or taken lightly. And even the idea of removing Republicans from power, in my mind, I'm like, but then I'm like, wait a minute. You're only removing them from holding office where they can appoint people and change laws, but they're still working with way more money than everybody else and insidiously spreading false information and spreading hate and perpetuating their own fear and perpetrator trauma onto the public, even when they're not in power. Yeah. So I imagine, I don't know if the right people were put in power, if they could curb that somehow, and I think ideas like taking money out of campaigns is part of that. But it seems like something we need to address on a much, much deeper level than just whoever's in power right now gets to make the rules. Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's where I am interested in ideas like Buddhist socialism. Like what would like democratic socialism, Buddhist socialism, like the way Bernie says, it's not me, it's us, right? It's like it has to be an entire movement. Mm-hmm. Because then it's really changing from the hearts out. Right. And not some kind of top-down authoritative thing that's going to get rebelled against. We're collectively changing our mindset to move in a different direction uniformly and in participation and collaboration and cooperation instead of this continuous us and them mentality, which is just digging us a hole. Yeah, it needs to be ground up. It needs to be intersectional. It needs to be understanding that different contexts have different levels of extractivism and different ways that trauma is manifesting. So, but the overall goal should be that it's ground up, and we're building solidarity with each other. And then it's through that solidarity, then, that the deeper level transformation can happen, right? And so then, the largest. So I mean, like if we dealt with issues around healthcare, education, housing, like class is a big issue. If we could deal with the issue of class, that might go a long way to deactivating a certain amount of European Americans that are identifying as white in a negative way.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Right? So it's like, it's intersectional. To help heal racism, we have to heal the issues around class. To help heal the issues around class, we have to heal the issues around race. Like, it's interdependent.
Mm-hmm. Maybe to something else about that point, mental health and education. Earlier, we were talking about the manifestations of gun violence and whatnot, and I wanted to point out what I thought was a solution that you presented. I'll read from your paper again. I don't want to spoil it for anybody who's going to be reading it, but you say mental health and wellness should become the focus of the education process rather than a supplement to it. In addition, religious institutions must be challenged to provide their congregations with contemplative practices that support people to be in touch with the ground of being and to heal from trauma and addiction. I really like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really, I think mental health is, and overall just personal and collective wellness is such a huge part of every aspect of our lives, and to build it from the ground up rather than supplementary, try to put Band-Aids on our problems. It's going to, I think, create a whole different paradigm for being for our society. Right.
And so I think, we had the separation of church and state for good reasons, because there was this fucked up dogmatic Christianity that was doing a lot of stupid shit. So we needed to separate that out. But then what happened is the scientific materialist paradigm took over, and that became the dominant view, right? So the goal of life is material consumption. So then in high school, like, what is more important to learn when I'm in middle school and high school? How to deal with my emotions, how to deal with trauma, or being aware of amino acid chains in chemistry, and the protein formation of whatever. What's more important for me to know at that point in my life? Okay, so we've been dominated by the scientific materialist worldview for so long that we think education should be that's the focus. Is I should be learning chemistry, physics, and high level like calculus in high school, instead of learning how to breathe and be in touch with my body and deal with my anger and like my violent impulses when they come up. When we're talking about history, that it is this disembodied whitewashed version of history. It's not this like embodied, like what's really going on experience. So the Dalai Lama, actually, he just it was out of this research they did at Emory University, neuroscientists working with monastics and other Tibetan yogis, like with meditation. So he calls it C, social, emotional, ethical learning. And it's basically a curriculum for K through 12 school teachers. It's available online. It's free. It's in 12 different languages, and it's secular. It's not even Buddhist. So you can take it up as a secular, non-religious practice, or if you are a religious community or school or organization, you can integrate it into your religious context.
That sounds so cool. C, social, emotional, ethical learning.
Yeah.
Wow.
And so it's a curriculum, an online training that any school teacher can learn how to do. And so it has within it somatic trauma therapy as part of the deal, right?
Amazing.
Another example would be the University of Virginia has this whole contemplative studies program where they basically adopted a whole school district in West Virginia and implemented contemplative practices as part of the curriculum in the schools. Like that's like it wasn't Buddhist, it wasn't like it's just
secular
mindfulness, or not even. So the Christians are allergic to mindfulness because they think
Yeah.
Not all critics, some critics. So they call it attention, focusing attention.
Okay.
Okay. But anyway, the point being that our education system, starting from kindergarten all the way through high school, we should already be teaching mindfulness practice. We should already be teaching at the level that it's appropriate, an understanding of what trauma is and how it works, and then, practices of how to heal trauma. And then I know the teachers' strike here in LA that happened, one of their big pushes now is they want to create community schools with wraparound services.
Really? Oh.
And so the idea is that the school becomes a community center. It's not just for the kids, it's for the parents as well.
Wow, I didn't hear that. That's cool.
And the wraparound services includes mental health.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the direction I'm talking about, is like, it's a working class, labor union. What if we integrate that with what the Dalai Lama is talking about, that it becomes mainstream, that contemplative practice and working with trauma is how we, like, it's just part of our education system.
Yeah. Man, if we can get our shit together, the future is looking bright. Wow. That sounds like such an awesome, comprehensive way to engage in education and healing from the ground up. That's so cool. Man.
So the hard part then is, so this gets back to like when we were talking about the beginning a new practice, right? So when I was living in this community with, like, say I was at this monastery and there was like 20 monks all living together. You're living together as a community, shit comes up and you got to deal with it. Yeah. And so then we had this practice to deal with it, right? We're all going through life together as human beings. Say we're a group of people who, our kids are all going to the same school together, and we find out in this one family abuse is going on, right? So how do we as a community take care of that? Like, so...
Yeah, that's tricky. I'm curious to hear what you're saying. I'm like getting nervous thinking about, we gotta confront the issue.
So that's what I'm saying. As soon as you come back into your body, then you're going to have to deal with your shit, right? Yeah, so if we as a society start coming back into our body, we're going to have to start dealing with our shit, right?
Yeah.
So we have all these movements like Black Lives Matter, Me Too movement, the whole consciousness raising around homophobia and queer. It's like all these areas where extractivism or violence takes place. It's like as a collective now, we can no longer be desensitized to that.
Yeah, I think the shift is kind of towards radical inclusivity, which I really dig. Which I think is part of what Down With the Dharma is about too, right?
And
being more inclusive.
Yeah, so I mentioned, I know Angela Davis's sister, Fania Davis, and maybe I'm mispronouncing her name, but she's based in the Bay Area, and so she has this whole, it's called transformative justice. So it's, they have, like, as part of the prison abolition movement, there's this idea of restorative justice, and sometimes it's called transformative justice, and the idea is, as a community, you're dealing with the trauma that individuals are acting out with on each other. You're creating circles of healing to where that trauma can be dealt with, and then there is not the need for the prison. Like, the prison is there as a backup, as a consequence, if the person won't open up to the healing process. You still have that last measure of containment.
Yeah.
And incentive. But even, so we have to have restorative justice or transformative justice as part of our everyday societal experience, as part of the experience of the school, the workplace, the community, the church, the Buddhist temple, the whatever. It's like, psychotherapy is like, I could have something going on and I can go talk to somebody in a separate space.
Yeah.
This is saying when shit's going on, we're no longer turning our heads away from it as a community. That we're going to deal with it as a community. And it may mean separate spaces for people to be in. There's a need for, I understand, need for safety or whatever the realities of the situation. But overall, what we're saying is, whatever the trauma is, we have to embrace it together as a community, and we have to heal it as a community.
Yeah.
So if I personally don't have, I took a 12-year monastic detour, and I didn't have any kids, and my wife and I right now are karma. So far, we haven't had kids.
Yeah.
But I could imagine if I'm a parent, my kid's going to school, say he's like, whatever, like an 8-year-old son, and he brings a friend over, and the friend starts telling me that, oh, shit's going on at home, like my dad is doing X.
Yeah.
Okay. We need a system in which, as a community, through the school, through the community, we can support that family to deal with that stuff.
Yeah, that's so tricky.
Yeah. Which means it's like I think that's the thing. It's like for so long we've gone on imagining like it's not there, it doesn't exist, or we're pretending it doesn't exist, or
Yeah.
So that's another.
Because also the solution is sometimes you call the police on the person if they're abusive, but then we don't want to get the police involved because sometimes they react differently to different ethnic groups, and a lot of people don't want to get the police involved, and then they don't want to get involved themselves, and so the traditional means of acknowledging the problem aren't satisfactory.
Yeah, again, so that's, and I haven't had a chance to really understand more about it, but this whole idea of transformative justice that Finnea Davis is doing, or this restorative justice movement, like this idea, like that is what they're trying to figure out. Like, how do you not have to have the police? Like, how do you not have to have the prison? Like, how can the school, the community center, the church, the whatever, deal with this?
I think so. We're kind of shifting paradigms from like the teacher-student relationship is changing, and like the Sangha is the new Buddha, and things like this. And I think as we start to work together more, we'll stop deferring to authority figures to solve our problems. And so, like you're saying, we can do it within the community rather than, let's get the police involved or some other authority figure involved. So I do see us moving in a progressive way towards community engagement as we start to realize that authority figures aren't all they are cracked up to be.
Right.
Yeah,
and like, let's get real. Like, what do we actually need to learn? Like, when I'm in school, what do I really need to learn? If I want to become a scientist at some point, yes, I need to study high levels of chemistry.
But if you learn to deal with your mind and your emotions at the ground level, then you're going to absorb all of that information way easier. You're going to be more in tune with following your heart and going after the fields that you're actually interested in. Right. Your whole life is going to flow more easily. Right.
Yeah. And if like I grew up in this Republican family, then I became liberal, and now I'm basically getting into socialism. I'm like still a newbie to the thing, but it overall seems to make sense to me. But our overall collective approach of how we're organizing ourselves and what we're doing. Okay, so we do need a baseline of material security, right? People need food, they need clothes, they need shelter, they need health care, they need transportation, they need art, they need culture. We need a baseline of material security and stability. Yeah. And that means also we need to have a sustainable relationship with the planet and with nature. Yep. Right? Having said that, then I think this is one big contribution that Buddhism and whatever wisdom tradition that has been able to have this experience of this deeper ground of being, that there is a activity that we can engage in as humans that brings about a feeling of contentment and happiness that does not involve consuming more material stuff. Yeah. That sensual pleasure is good to a certain point, and then beyond that, if it gets into addiction, then it's a problem. material stability and comfort, obviously we need to, as a species, provide ourselves and the world around us material stability and security.
Yeah.
But then I feel like we need to open up to this deeper ground of being that can provide an experience of contentment and happiness that would then allow us to let go of defining happiness as making the most money, driving the fanciest car, whatever. So I think that's one of the big problems is
getting off the hedonic treadmill.
Yeah, we don't have a legitimate contemplative ground of being experience in which to channel our energy.
Yeah.
And so then the only outlet people see for happiness is consumption of material stuff. And so I think that's one reason why we do have this fucked up economic system where Jeff Bezos has X amount of money, right? I think it's coming from this worldview.
Yeah.
That's what's defining happiness.
We're all saying that's what my dream is too.
Right, exactly. So we got to get off of that.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. So that's why I'm interested in this idea of Buddhist socialism, that it's because traditionally Marxism, socialism has focused on the material part of it.
Yeah.
And there is a certain spiritual component because just the inherent nature of having group solidarity involves an experience of interdependence. So there is a certain letting go of the ego to be part of a bigger deal.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we need to add in contemplative practice and awareness of trauma and an openness, whether you want to put it into a religious lens or a non-religious lens, but some openness to this ground of being, which will allow people to experience contentment and will allow people to release trauma, which will paradoxically allow greater ease in creating that material stability.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think, well, something we've even acknowledged in this conversation, there seems to be a bit of a pendulum swinging and reactivity, and things go all the way one way and then reacts to the other. And I feel like this I've said this I think on another podcast, this shift into this next era is kind of like the Hegelian synthesis of the past paradigms that we've existed in. So like Marxism, the idea of it is kind of reaction to the Industrial Revolution. There is all this new material wealth, so it's this philosophy that's discussing this new materialism that's arising. So, I mean, in ancient times, we had far more connection to the spiritual nature and the harmony of being. Yeah. And then we got really removed from that with the materialism, Industrial Revolution, after agriculture.
Yeah, we as European and European Americans, Yes. And then everyone that's been forced under that paradigm since then. Yeah.
In one way or another.
Yeah.
So it seems like now we're grappling with the shortcomings of this new way of being and looking to turn back to ancient wisdom and like we're coupling Buddhist practices with the somatic psychology. And it seems like the paradigm that we're moving into is a synthesis of the spiritual and the material. Yeah. I think there's some hope for it. Just on NPR yesterday, I was listening. They said a poll they did in 2000. They did it again. Many more people who identify as white are aware and acknowledging institutional racism, violence towards people of color. And that's largely because of the internet, and it's more everybody has a voice now, and there's so much more footage. And so, education tends to shake people out of their hold up ways of being, and so we're exposed to it more, so we're open to it. And I think that also connects us and lets people see that we're not all so different, and we do need to work together.
Yeah, and I think it's like younger people are more open to socialism, like younger people just are tending to be more inclusive despite these structural injustice patterns that are still heavy in the society.
Yeah.
So there's still, society is still a machine that's churning out white supremacy, whether you like it or not.
Yep.
But there is, it's this weird thing of like, okay, Obama got to be president, Oprah Winfrey, blah, blah, blah. There's a certain on one level, a level of consciousness and integration has happened. On another level, it still hasn't happened yet. Like this deeper level still hasn't happened yet. And so I guess, I don't know, I mean, I think about like one easy answer is to say, oh, well, it's just as younger people get it more because these ideas have been out long enough that now but I feel like I'm a little wary of just saying that. Like, I feel like there's got to be some intentional process as well. So I go back to the Buddha's teachings on the Four Noble Truths. He said, okay, first you got to get it conceptually, and then you got to put it into practice, and then the practice actually has to bear fruit, like reach fruition, right? So again, with this idea of the education system, conceptual knowledge or consciousness raising is one of the big steps. But then there's this deeper level of just practice and work that has to be done that we have to get into. And that people might like the idea of transformation, but then when you get to the work of doing it, it's like, whoa, I don't know.
I think before I ever really got into meditation, I heard, some people sit down and meditate and they'll start laughing or they'll start crying. Wow, I want to experience that. Not really knowing what I was asking for. Like, oh, you're having like these random emotional reactions because these deep feelings are welling up from deep inside when you finally get quiet. And that shit is not easy. When it actually happened, I was like, what did I get myself into? It's scary to try to sit with such difficult feelings.
And then I think when we talk about issues of social justice, so to open up to the experience of suffering that's happening, it's an embodied experience. So on a previous podcast that we haven't posted it yet, but we interviewed Lama Rod Owens.
Cool.
So he's saying, we were talking about embodiment, and he's saying there's a difference between taking care of your body and being embodied. That's two different things. So then, the experience of embodied anti-racist transformation, or embodied anti-sexism transformation, or embodied anti-homophobic transformation, that involves an experience in your body where you're having to hold a level of intensity and weight in your body that you hadn't had to hold before. And so then it's like,
when you say hold, do you mean experience in the body, or hold as in like hold space, like allow it to be?
I feel it as like, it's a level of density and weight that you have to get in touch with and become comfortable with. That it's like the idea of white fragility, right? Like you try to talk to somebody who, I mean, I'm white, so it's weird when I say this, but if you try to talk to someone who's white about being white, they get all nervous and find all different ways of trying to dissociate, basically. So from a Buddhist perspective or a trauma perspective, what's happening is that they're experiencing intense body sensations that they're overwhelmed by, and it's hard for them to be with it. And so that's my feeling then when it's like getting in touch with the weight of the suffering of racism or sexism or homophobia. It's an experience in your body of heaviness that you have to get in touch with. And in the beginning, it feels like it's too much. It's going to overwhelm you. It's going to crush you or kill you, right? And so then you want to avoid it.
Well, my identity is that I'm not racist. I'm not sexist. I'm not homophobic. So if I sit and I think about it and actually some of those sexist, racist thoughts arise, then the me I thought I was is going to die. So I feel threatened by my own actual implicit bias.
So one level is I'll have this strong, fucked up racist thought come out of me, right? Or another experience just is I'm getting in touch with the suffering of racism that we're experiencing as a society on a collective level, which is an experience of heaviness that I have to be able to be with. So I have to open up. So Thich Nhat Hanh would say you have your individual body, and then you have your Sangha body, which means your collective body.
Okay.
And you have to be in touch with your Sangha body, right? So if you're going to be down, if you're going to be an embodied and a racist, it means you have to open up to the level of heaviness that people of color are carrying with them all the time.
Yeah.
Which you're not going to fully experience it because you're not a person of color, but you're gonna tap into some direct level of it because you're part of that body. We're part of a collective body, so you're going to have to be in touch with a level of heaviness, intensity, and weight that you weren't in touch with before.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is this like practice to be able to do that. You can't just go to the gym and automatically lift that level of weight. You got to go through practice to get to where you have the awareness and equanimity around that level of sensation.
And that comes with your personal practice of sitting with your somewhat difficult emotions, and over time you begin to be more equanimous and more tolerant of those things and accepting, and you can integrate your own feelings, and then you can expand it to the Sangha body. Yeah,
and that's what I think.
Right?
I think this is kind of new areas of exploration, like say like the East Bay Meditation Center in the Bay Area. I'm terrible with names, so I can't ever. I think it's Andrew Yang. He's a Buddhist teacher in the East Bay. But anyway, okay. So the point being, it's a transformation process that everyone needs to engage in, and there's stages. So a first stage is you need people of color need their own space separate from white people, because just having white people in the room is triggering and traumatizing.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter who the white person is. They may be the most down anti-racist white person in the world. Doesn't matter. They're walking around with white skin on. They're going to trigger that. Just that is triggering, right?
Yeah.
So people of color need a people of color space where they feel safe, where they can open up to the trauma that they're experiencing and work on it. And then white people need a space to be together to open up and deal with the stuff that we have that we need to deal with. So just you and me, these two white guys talking, we're doing it right now.
Yeah.
So it just happens we're broadcasting, but this is it, right?
Yeah.
And then a later stage is for those who are interested, willing, ready, and able, members from both of those groups get together, and then that's the exploratory zone of transformative justice, transformative healing.
Mm-hmm.
We have people of color and white people in the same space with the intention to heal our collective trauma.
Yeah.
And that, I think there's experimental pockets of that happening. And so I see that as the ultimate, like, structure or process that needs to happen. But it's going to be messy, and we have to figure out how to do it in such a way that we're not making people who have been traditionally in the target group have to bear disproportionately the amount of emotional work or labor involved to do that transformation process. So that's something we have to figure out, and I want to figure that out, but I haven't yet been involved in that yet, so I can't speak about. But I see that as the process. Yeah.
It sounds like a long-term strategy, and I want it all fixed now.
Yeah.
So shit. Yeah. It seems a little frightening to step into murky water. You know, it's going to be messy.
Yeah.
You don't want to hurt anybody. You don't want to get hurt.
Right.
You don't want to cause more trauma.
Right.
Or make people, like you said, disproportionately feel responsible.
Yeah.
Which is why it is important for white presenting individuals like us to talk amongst ourselves, to try to do some of this work for ourselves and those communities we might represent.
Right.
I guess there's a little bit of an overlap with one of the things you mentioned in your paper that they also mentioned in that NPR thing I heard the other day.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the idea. Well, one of the things you said is that people of color and European Americans who are ready should engage in rituals in which the European Americans, on behalf of themselves and their ancestors, apologize to people of color and their ancestors. But only European Americans who are engaged in serious reparations work should engage in these rituals of apology. Otherwise, the rituals become just a way for European Americans to appease their guilt without actually changing their exploitive behavior. We might also call that virtue signaling.
Right.
Right. You have a lot of the politicians pandering or people who want to sound good on social media by going to a protest or something.
So
it seems like that adds some more messiness to this healing work that needs to get done.
Yeah, so I'm drawing from a variety of sources for that. So one is Thich Nhat Hanh, when he was allowed to go back to Vietnam, did these big rituals, which he called, it's a traditional Buddhist ritual that he was correlating with grand requiem masses that they do in Catholic churches. So the ritual is a ritual for souls who have died but have kind of got stuck in some weird in-between place. And then this ritual is to help them have a rebirth into a better dimension.
Okay.
And then in my study at Claremont School of Theology, there's this theologian from Ghana named Emmanuel Larte, and he wrote a book called Post-Colonializing God. And he talked about this ritual that they did in Ghana where descendants of black African slave traders living in Ghana and descendants of slaves living in the Caribbean and the U.S. got together in Ghana to do a ritual where the descendants of the black slave traders apologized to the descendants of the slaves. So it was a ritual, and so from a traditional African perspective, the idea is that because if you don't have a good relationship with your ancestors, that's what causes suffering to happen, and that's what causes not like social suffering, natural world suffering, all kinds of suffering. So the idea is if suffering is happening, it means that the relation with the ancestors is there's something going on.
Yeah.
So they were doing these rituals who basically these descendants, it was a perpetrator group apologizing to a victim group on behalf of their ancestors. And it was a victim group receiving the apology of a perpetrator group on behalf of their ancestors.
Yeah.
So the idea is we're all carrying our ancestors in us.
Yep.
And we need to we have to relate to each other on behalf of our ancestors.
Yeah, it seems like a great start.
And so then, so there's this nun, Sister Kyra Jewel, who she was an African American nun with Thich Nhat Hanh while I was a monk, and so I was in India at that time when Thich Nhat Hanh was in Vietnam, and so she was with him when he was doing these rituals in Vietnam, and so she was saying we need to do these rituals in the United States.
Yeah.
So, like going to places where suffering took place, like plantations or places where Native American massacres happened.
Yeah.
Having rituals to heal this ancestral suffering. So when Standing Rock was happening, you had this guy who was a veteran. There was a whole group of veterans that went to Standing Rock to support the movement there. And there was a guy named Wesley Clark who's like the grandson of General Wesley Clark. And he was part of a regiment that was part of the original military regiments that were involved in massacring Native Americans.
Wow.
So during the Standing Rock movement, they had a ceremony where this group of veterans who were mainly European Americans apologized to the Native Americans. So it was basically the same thing, like on behalf of their ancestors, who is the perpetrator group they're apologizing to the people who are the descendants of the victim group.
Yeah.
And so then Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz talks about this, how she's a Native American scholar who was there when that happened, and she said that this was a very powerful healing moment for everybody involved.
Wow.
And so they were there for the protest, right? So they were fully down, putting their body on the line.
Yeah.
And then that kind of, in a sense, was one of the things that qualified them to do that ritual, right? It wasn't like they're just
they
showing up
and just
right.
Yeah, they were there, like you said,
Right.
putting their bodies on the line. They were down for the cause. They were
right.
They were embodying it.
Right. And this was a group of indigenous people that were open to and wanting to do that ritual, right?
Yeah.
So obviously the what you don't want to have happen is just a group of white people that want to do this ritual and they force it on a group of people of color, and then like that's again, we're back in the same problem.
Yeah.
So but I guess I see that as one possible long-term outcome, is that at some point we can start doing collective rituals where we are reconnecting with our ancestors and healing the ancestral trauma through ritual. So again, this idea then that we need to make this process of transformation a collective one, and we need to scale it up. Like it's got to be big. It's got to be
multifaceted,
right?
Ground up.
Yeah.
Really well thought out and embodied.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a big task, and I'm really grateful for the work that you've put into it so far. It's really it was inspiring to read your paper. I know we had touched on it, and you have a video on YouTube where you're delivering it that I listened to, but it was really fulfilling for me to finally have the paper in my hands and read it.
Yeah, and I know, like, when I wrote it, it's like a very dense paper. It's very it's heavy and dense. So
it's palatable too. Like I don't, I have some grounding in Buddhist theory, but I don't know that much about racial formation.
Yeah.
I don't know that much about. I've been to a therapist who we did some somatic practices, but I don't really know it from the clinical side of it. Yeah. And so, I mean, I took my time going through it, but I felt like it was very palatable. I was able to understand it all, and it was engaging. So I didn't think it was too technical.
Okay, because I guess I'm just saying I'm glad that we can talk about it in this format. So it gives a way for people. It gives a way for me to express what I'm trying to say in a more accessible way.
Yeah.
Like I had to do the paper as like a wonky way to fully wrap my head around it through the academic process. Mm-hmm. But I feel like there's other ways of expressing this and doing this work.
Yeah. Totally.
That this I mean, I think the podcast is a new cultural form that it can be a bridge, or it's a way of expressing a truth in a way that's accessible. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's not a soundbite; it's long form, so people get the full.
Right? Yeah, it's a deep dive. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there anything else you want to say about the paper before we kind of wrap it up or move on? We got any feedback?
Yeah, a little bit. Not a lot. I feel like it is so heavy in depth and involved, and it is kind of this crossover of these different disciplines that don't normally talk to each other. So I feel like there's just not a forum really for it yet to be discussed. Like it's kind of it's like this intersectional space that hasn't yet developed a collective community space where I would be talking about it. Right?
Yeah. So I guess either Buddhist circles or in racially conscious circles. It's
right. Yeah,
it's a little bit exclusionary for either.
Yeah, it's like you gotta get in depth into it. Yeah.
Well, I'm glad that we could talk about it. This is cool.
Yeah.
If people wanted to read it, it's on Kalfu Journal.
Yeah, you can go to, if you just Google the Dependent Origination of Whiteness. Yeah, if you're in school and you have access to a library, you can get to the journal that way. Or if you just Google the paper I have, like on my academia webpage, it's there as a PDF, so people.
Academia.edu is the website where scholars post their work. Yeah,
so I want to support the journal. So if there's a way you can go directly to the journal, or if you want to contribute to the journal, you should access it that way. But if for whatever reason you can't afford that, then it's on my academia page they are free as a PDF. Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
If people who are not involved in Buddhism or not involved in social justice right now wanted to get involved, do you have any starting or intermediate tips for how people can get involved with either?
As far as Buddhism, this is the thing, like Buddhism has become the upper middle way consumer capitalism deal, right?
Yeah.
So, the best way would be go to your local Buddhist temple, right? and there's different temples that focus on different things. So if you're into meditation, then you got to go to certain ones that are into meditation, right? But like say here in LA, there's tons of temples like Thai, Sri Lankan, and they'll usually have like one day of the week where there's a meditation class, where you can go for that, learn how to meditate. If you want to go deep dive into meditation boot camp and you have the luxury of being able to take 10 days off, you can do you can do the Goenka Vipassana, and that's free.
Yeah, but that is like a boot camp.
Yeah,
and if you haven't processed your own trauma, it might
be re-traumatizing.
For some, I've had some people tell me that they've had reactions. So I think the general rule is like if you have some really intense stuff to deal with it before you go into seclusion for 10 days.
Yeah.
But I've done 2 of these myself, and I think they're great, and I found a tremendous benefit from them.
Yeah, and then another would be the Thich Nhat Hanh community, that they have local groups all over the world. And so it's considered like a local sangha. So they meet in somebody's house or in a church or somewhere, and it's just a group that gets together once a week to practice meditation and read some of Thich Nhat Hanh's teachings and discuss them. And there are some that are just POC groups. You can find them, but again, they tend to be more rare. So, if you're a person of color, you may be one of the only people of color there, or you might be with some Asian folks, and depending on the Asian folks that are involved, they may or may not be engaged in issues of social justice and anti-racism or not. It depends.
Buddhism is so vast. There's some people who practice it ritualistically and just it's all the cultural trappings, and they're not really into the philosophy. And then other people who have completely removed the cultural trappings and are far more into a secular approach to the philosophy and using the pragmatic tools that it offers.
Yeah.
So I think that was a little bit tricky for me at first too, navigating the different Buddhist circles and finding what works for me and what I'm interested in.
Yeah.
But with a little bit of legwork and a little bit of research on the computer or whatnot, I think there are so many different groups to get involved with. And now I know we're very fortunate here in Los Angeles. It's a hugely populous area and there's a lot of diversity. But for people in more secluded areas, I would definitely say there's more online groups these days. You can meet with teachers face to face over Skype and meditate with groups, even in an online forum. It's been interesting to see that new medium emerge for contemplative groups.
Yeah, and that's my co-host Nick and I were interested in a Buddhist care and counseling worker cooperative.
Oh, cool.
That could be working with people in person as well as online. And the idea is that it's a cooperative, and it's like I'm thinking of it like the gym. Like you have a membership at LA Fitness, and then So then that you can go, you could have a free sitting group, and then maybe like a once a week counseling session, and then like once a year, like a retreat kind of thing. And but this, again, the idea of scaling the thing up, I want to make a living, but I'm not trying to be like, there's a lot of Buddhism and mindfulness out there where it costs too much money. It's like prohibitively expensive. So the model of the school, the church, or some kind of cooperative system in which you can like, you can gain access to this and it doesn't cost a lot of money. That's I'm trying to figure that out.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. If I'm still around in Southern California and you guys are doing it down here, I'd love to participate in some way.
Yeah, sure.
I'm graduating next year, so I'm trying to branch out and see what I'm going to be doing afterwards. Like, to set myself up for success to keep it moving. Like I think these fundamental structures of school, church, health center. Mm-hmm. We got to figure out how to make contemplative practice become just woven into that fundamental infrastructure of the society. So it should be supporting diversity, right? So if there's a Buddhist version of it that's doing a good job, that should be supported. If there's a secular version that's doing a good job of it, that should be supported. Yeah. One of the things we didn't mention is those 10-day Goenka retreats are free.
Yeah.
Because if you find value, they encourage you to donate. And so one of the reasons I think you're doing this and why I think it will continue to proliferate is because when people engage with the contemplative practice, they see immediate and long-term benefits from that. Right. And they want to continue it. They want to contribute to it, perpetuate it, share it with the people they care about and the greater communities. So again, I'm really hopeful for the future as I'm seeing contemplative practices come more and more into the forefront of our culture through Buddhism and the mindfulness craze, which, there's some debate about it being commodified, but ultimately more people are meditating. That's kind of cool, right? Yeah. And then yoga's blowing up, and so I'm really hopeful for the future of contemplative practice being integrated into the wellness and mental and emotional health of the populace.
Yeah, and so I think that's, like the opposite of extractivism is regeneration.
Yeah, I like that.
And regeneration is like an experience of diversity and abundance. So, like the idea of like, say for example, farming, like instead of extracting from the earth, you have a regenerative relationship with the earth in which you're wanting to increase the fertility of the soil instead of decrease it. And as a byproduct, you get food to eat. Yep. so then this idea of contemplative practice opening up to this ground of being that we're trying to open up to an experience of regeneration in which we're supporting each other. And so then it's like it becomes like accessible and like inclusive as opposed to exclusive and inaccessible.
Yeah. And then we get to reap the rewards of deeper fulfillment, connectivity to each other and to ourselves, and you get to reap a whole bunch of good fruits and veggies from that kind of connection.
Exactly.
Yeah. I love it. Oh, super cool. All right, is there anything else you want to share before we wind this down?
No, I think we covered all the bases. As far as I can tell you.
Sweet. So I like to end with a couple of curious questions. The name of my podcast is A Flair for the Curious.
Yes, right.
So like your podcast, it's got some double meanings to it. The word curious can be inquisitive, or it can also be a little bit strange. So I'll just ask you like 3 simple questions. You can answer any way you like or pass. Okay. What is something that you are curious to learn more about or have been interested in lately? It could be completely unrelated to all that we've been talking about. If you watched a cool documentary or read a cool book, something you're curious about these days.
I'm getting back into golf.
Golf.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Nurture your body, keep it moving, right?
Yeah, and
One way or
I'm
another.
kind of mixed about it because, like, you think golf, you think Trump, you think white supremacy or whatever, right?
Yeah, I mean, you could grow a lot of food on that golf course.
Right. So I don't know. Long term, I don't know if it's, but yeah, like, if you play on a public course, it's pretty accessible. Like,
Yeah.
like for $12 you can play. Like, yeah. So
Interesting.
I used to play when I was growing up, and then I stopped, and then now I'm back into it again, and so yeah, there is this whole mind-body connection thing going on that. So it's for exercise, but it's also like it's like a practice as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I wouldn't have guessed. That's cool. That's the fun of asking these random questions. I'm starting to think that maybe I should start the conversations with these random questions because I get like answers I would never.
Yeah. But yeah, it's this weird. It does bring up this like, oh, should I say it or not? Because that's so white to say I'm in there.
Yeah.
But then now, yeah, these courses I'm playing at, like, it's mostly Asian people playing. So I don't know. I'm like, here I am trying to justify my golf. Yeah.
A lot comes up. Yeah, a lot to work on. Can we sit with these difficult feelings?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
All right, cool. I like it. The other one is going to be our other definition of curious. Something strange or curious.
Yeah.
So have you ever had a curious or mystical or unexplainable experience? And how did that change your life or your view on anything?
Yeah. So, like, after I had been meditating for a while, I got to a place. This is when I was like a monk, and I was like sitting like 4 times a day, an hour a day. And so then I would get to a point where basically my thoughts would just chill out, right? And so then I would just be in these spaces of silence. And then I could feel like the movement of my mind before the thought became language.
Mm-hmm.
So it was just like I could feel this movement happening like from this ground, and then a thought would happen, right? So one day I was sitting and I could feel like, oh, there's this movement, something's about to happen, and then there was a noise that happened outside.
Mm-hmm.
I can't even remember what the noise was, but it was like exactly that. like the
You were tapped into the ground of phenomenon,
right?
Not just internal,
right? Yeah. So the distinction between inside and outside was like not that distinction was not there. Yeah. And so that kind of general experience sometimes I mean, Jung talked about it as like synchronicities, but like like where you feel like something's about to happen and then it happens. Or, yeah. So I feel like that. I have this bell that I use for meditation that I had for a long time since I was a monk, and then I just lost it recently. And then I just started this meditation group, and then I was thinking, oh, maybe somebody in the Sangha will bring a bell. And like 2 days later, some guy brought a bell.
Yeah.
I'm not talking like psychic powers is like a whole side trip that you can get caught into, and that's like a waste of time or whatever. So I don't even think of this as like a psychic power. It's just more if you're in the present moment and you're in touch with more subtle levels of vibration, then you can just feel things as they're coming into manifestation.
I'm right there with you in that it's not a special phenomenon, but because the ordinary person's existence is at such a gross level that we're so estranged from the subtleties of things like this, it becomes an apparent superpower or psychic phenomenon, quote unquote. So I have these synchronicities appear too, and it's really it's a trip for me. I tend to just take it as maybe I'm on the right track when the synchronicities appear, but I'm curious, like how did that affect your perception of how to be in the world, or did it have any impact on you other than like, oh, that's cool?
Well, it just made me feel happy, and then like it's just like like this feeling of regeneration, and like this idea of like the ground of being, this soil of consciousness, that it's like an interdependent ground of being that is regenerative, right?
Yeah.
Like there was a need, and the system met the need.
Interesting.
Yeah.
All right.
The system spontaneously responded to the need without even having to like ask for it. It just happened.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, meditation's a trip, right?
Yeah.
Wow. All right. Great. Good answer. Last question. Okay. Can you name a time that you experienced profound beauty? Something tremendously beautiful.
Yeah, Mother Mira, my first guru who I ever got in touch with, she's like, when I'm in the room with her, I can look at her for a certain amount of time, and then it's like, it's so beautiful that it's too intense and I have to turn away.
Wow.
And it's not like beautiful, like fashion model beautiful. It's like, I mean, on one level, she's beautiful, but like it's on another level, again, it's not a sexual thing. It's like, it's this feeling. There's so much beauty and richness there. It's like eating chocolate mousse. You can only eat so much at one time.
Yeah.
You can't just like wolf the whole thing down.
Yeah. So I think I know what you're talking about. So I saw you at the event with Mother Mira. I went for Darshan, and we were in a big empty room.
Yeah.
And unlike other holy figures that come through, she did no decoration, no wall hangings behind her, no Om symbols.
Yeah.
In the lobby, there was a small place where some people were selling books and pictures, but very small scale compared to other events I've been to. And she's just sitting at the front of the room, as you said, and everybody's in silence. And there's this tremendous beauty emanating. I might liken it to being inside of the most magnificent cathedral.
Yeah.
But it's all coming from one person in the center of the room.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. That's I get what you're saying by that. It's pretty tremendous.
And I remember once I went with a friend of mine and her 2 kids to see Amachi, and her kids were like 5 and 8. And like when Amachi came out, the girl was like, she's so beautiful. And she was like calling her brother, like, look,
wow.
like, so speaking of regeneration, Mother Mira's coming October 10 here in LA. She'll be here. Like,
nice.
So that'll be after we've posted this, but that's the other thing. There's gurus, Mother Mira, Amachi, that come to the U.S. and anybody can go see them, and it's free. And that there's these beings are here, and usually if it's the deep level real thing, it's free. Yeah. I mean, there's a way that they support themselves, but what they offer usually is, or at least some part of it, is free. Yeah.
I like that.
Because they're tapped into regeneration, they can do it. Yeah.
It's a tricky one. Transmuting it. I'm working on manifesting abundance, so I can just give it out freely as much as I'm able. It's a tricky dance we're doing here on this. Big blue rock. Yeah. Wow. Cool. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down and chat with me. This has been thoroughly enjoyable. Thank you for writing your paper. People can check it out in the places that we mentioned, academia.edu, and at the Kalfu Journal of Comparative and Relational Ethnic Studies. Thank you so much.
Cool. Thank you too.
All right, we're going to wrap it up here. Thanks everybody for listening. Talk to you later.
All right, thanks for listening all the way to the end of this chat with John Freese. Links to John's article, The Dependent Origination of Whiteness, and the Kalfu Journal of Comparative and Relational Ethnic Studies, as well as others, are in the notes of this show and available at aflairforthecurious.com. Please take a second to subscribe, rate, review, and share this podcast. Send me your feedback directly at aflairforthecurious@gmail.com or on social media. I'd love to hear what you thought about some of our topics and points.
I know I'm still learning a lot, and I have a long way to go with even basic vocabulary, but I'm so glad I was able to have this conversation about race and justice and be able to share it with all of you. The work is not easy, but if we're willing to take it on, the tools for navigating challenging experiences are definitely there. I know for me, Buddhist and other wisdom teachings have certainly given me the ability to engage with difficult emotions and remain present when I'd rather avoid the issue. I hope you all found some value in this discussion today. If you did, and would like to support us by more than just rating, reviewing, and sharing, your monetary support is also appreciated, and you can find links to contribute in the notes or by clicking on the support tab at aflairforthecurious.com. There you can donate through PayPal, Cash App, Venmo, Zelle, and Patreon. I'm going to try to get some merch going pretty soon to have something concrete to offer you all. Let me know if there's something specific that you would like to see. Lastly, I'll say that if you are listening to this in real time, over the winter of 2019-20, I'm on break from school until February and would love to collaborate during this time. If you'd like to be on an episode, have your music featured, or participate in some other way, please do reach out. Okay, you beautiful people. I do love you all. I hope you're staying well and taking good care of yourselves and each other. Stay curious, never stop questioning everything, and keep your hearts open. Peace.